Northern Africa has never been a simple region to define. Some descriptions imagine it as a vast arc of land, beginning at the Atlantic coast beside Morocco and running eastward to the Suez Canal and the shores of the Red Sea. Within this broad space lie several modern nations: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Sudan, together with the territory of Western Sahara. These lands share the presence of the Sahara Desert to the south and the Mediterranean to the north, yet each has developed its own character through centuries of migration, trade, and conquest. A more limited expression, North Africa, usually points to the western Mediterranean corner, made up of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, often joined by Libya because of its close historical ties. Over time, this same area has been called Northwest Africa, the Maghreb, or, in older European language, the Barbary Coast, showing how names have shifted with political power and cultural influence. Long before modern states existed, ancient travellers used different words for the region. Greek writers spoke of Libya when describing the fertile belt above the Sahara, and sometimes even the whole continent. Roman administrators later used the name Africa for their province in what is now Tunisia and eventually extended it to all the lands facing the Mediterranean. Arab geographers adapted these earlier terms and created new ones, while also using expressions that reflected their own view of the Western horizon. The people who lived there were given many labels as well. Medieval Europeans referred to them as Berbers, a word rooted in older Latin speech, yet the inhabitants themselves preferred names drawn from their own languages and traditions. Such changing vocabulary reveals how outside observers repeatedly tried to make sense of a region that was far more diverse than any single title could suggest. The physical landscape of the western part of the region is dominated by the long spine of the Atlas Mountains, which rise above Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia before fading into the desert. To the east, Libya is largely an ocean of sand broken only by two coastal zones that have supported settled life since antiquity. Egypt, although geographically close, followed a path that often set it apart. The valley of the Nile created a civilization with deep roots and strong links to the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, giving it a rhythm of history different from its western neighbours. Sudan, stretching from the deserts of the north to the tropical south, became another meeting place where languages, beliefs, and peoples from many directions overlapped. Both Egypt and Sudan acted as bridges between Africa and the wider world, connected to North Africa, yet never entirely contained within it. Human presence in these lands reaches back to the earliest chapters of prehistory. In parts of Algeria, traces of very ancient hominin activity have been uncovered, suggesting that early ancestors of humanity moved through the Maghreb hundreds of thousands of years ago. Stone tools found in Morocco and Algeria show that communities related to early forms of Homo erectus lived and hunted there. Over long periods, new techniques of shaping flint appeared, resembling those known from the eastern Mediterranean, and by the Middle Paleolithic, the craft of producing finely worked flakes had reached remarkable levels. Across Tunisia, Algeria, and the Sahara, a distinctive tradition of toolmaking spread, created by people well adapted to dry climates and open plains. The few human remains connected with these industries indicate the presence of Neanderthal groups, whose physical traits varied from west to east. Around 15,000 years ago, another cultural phase emerged along the coasts of the Maghreb and Cyrenaica. Blade tools replaced earlier forms, marking the arrival of modern Homo sapiens and the gradual disappearance of Neanderthal communities. This development was followed by a new tradition centered in southern Tunisia, where hunters exploited the wildlife that flourished around great seasonal lakes. The environment at that time was far less arid than today, allowing populations to move across broad territories. Rather than sudden invasion, the transition toward farming and herding seems to have occurred through the slow adoption of new ideas. By the 6th and 5th millennia before the present era, domesticated animals, especially cattle, became the foundation of life across much of North Africa, while hunting continued to play an important role. This early pastoral culture left deep marks on the landscape. Stone implements remained in use for thousands of years because the region possessed few metal ores, and a true Bronze Age never developed as it did elsewhere. In the mountains and deserts, prehistoric artists carved and painted images of animals that have long vanished from these areas: elephants, rhinoceroses, and great buffaloes, testifying to climates very different from the modern Sahara. The style of this art bears little resemblance to that of ancient Egypt or prehistoric Europe, suggesting an independent creative world that endured on the desert margins into historical times. Across the Maghreb, thousands of stone tombs were later constructed, forming silent monuments to communities whose names are now lost. Some of the largest structures found in Algeria reveal outside influences from the Mediterranean world, while still preserving local traditions. By the first millennium before the present era, these societies were beginning to encounter Phoenician traders and, later, Roman power, setting the stage for the complex history that would follow. The story of Northern Africa, from its earliest human footsteps to the dawn of recorded civilization, is therefore one of continual movement and exchange, shaped by deserts, seas, and the resilience of the peoples who lived between them. Northern Africa moved into the wider story of the Mediterranean during the first millennium before the present era, with the appearance of Phoenician sailors from the cities of Tyre and Sidon on the coast of today's Lebanon. These seafarers were not seeking new homelands but safe harbours and stopping points along the long commercial road that linked the eastern Mediterranean with the metal-rich lands of Spain. Their ships also followed a second path that touched Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. Unlike the Greeks, the Phoenicians did not establish large farming colonies. Their communities were small and practical, usually placed on offshore islands or on rocky headlands where vessels could be pulled onto sheltered beaches and protected from attack. Among these early outposts, one settlement would grow far beyond the rest. Carthage, whose name meant New City, rose on a favourable stretch of the Tunisian coast and gradually became the centre of Phoenician activity in the west. Tradition spoke of very early founding dates for places such as Cadiz in Spain, Utica in Tunisia, and Carthage itself. Yet archaeological remains suggest that permanent occupation began somewhat later, around the 8th century before the present era. From that time, evidence of Phoenician life appears along the coasts of North Africa and on the nearby islands of Sicily and Sardinia. For generations, these towns remained politically tied to their homeland, but only a few possessed hinterlands capable of supporting real growth. The rise of Carthage changed this pattern, as the old Phoenician cities in the east weakened under foreign rule and as Greek settlers expanded across Sicily and southern Italy. Carthage assumed leadership of the western communities. Conflicts with Greek rivals convinced its rulers that control of the North African shore was essential to survival. During the 5th and 4th centuries before the present era, Carthage forged an empire based on existing Phoenician towns and on new foundations of its own. Resistance from local peoples appears to have been limited, for the indigenous societies were scattered and lacked unified states. By the opening of the 4th century, the fertile peninsula near Carthage had been secured, and influence spread inland and along the coast. Carthaginian authority eventually stretched from the Gulf of Sidra to the Atlantic approaches of Morocco. Dozens of small stations were planted to guard trade routes and monopolies. Greek visitors called these places markets where inland tribes exchanged goods, but they also served as watering points and havens for ships. In the region of modern Libya, only a few early settlements existed, yet cities such as Leptis Magna, Sabratha and Oea prospered through commerce that crossed the Sahara to the Niger basin. Salted fish, purple dye, precious stones and exotic products flowed toward the Mediterranean, carried by caravans that moved between tribal intermediaries. Along the Tunisian coast, a chain of towns grew, some famous for agriculture, others for maritime trade. West of Carthage, the changing course of rivers altered the fortunes of ancient ports, leaving once busy harbours stranded inland. Beyond these lay a series of anchorages whose names preserve traces of the Phoenician language, reminders of a long maritime presence. A few, such as Hippo Dioritis and Hippo Regius, developed into important centres, yet none rivaled the wealth of the eastern shore. Ancient observers agreed that Carthage became one of the richest cities of its age, even though little of its treasure survives in the ground. Much of the commerce involved textiles, raw metals, food and slaves, goods that left few durable traces. The most profitable exchange was the traffic in tin, silver, gold and iron from the far west, traded for inexpensive manufactures from the Mediterranean. Carthage defended this business with relentless determination, driving away intruders and enforcing treaties that recognized its dominance. The vast mercenary armies it hired and the heavy minting of gold coins testify to the resources that trade provided. During the 5th century before the present era, Carthaginian captains undertook remarkable voyages along the Atlantic coast. One expedition sailed south past Morocco, engaging in silent barter with coastal peoples who offered gold for manufactured wares. Another travelled north along the shores of Spain and France in search of the tin lands of the Atlantic fringe. These journeys connected Carthage to networks that reached Brittany and perhaps beyond, though direct evidence of Phoenician presence in Britain has never been found. Cadiz later became the principal base for exploiting these Western opportunities. Despite periods of war, commercial ties with the Greek world remained strong. Pottery and luxury goods from Corinth, Athens, and other centres reached Carthaginian markets, while food and raw materials moved in the opposite direction. Contacts declined for a time, partly because Carthage adopted coinage later than many Greek states, yet merchants continued to frequent one another's ports. After the conquest of Alexander opened new markets in the east, Carthaginian traders once again became familiar figures in the great cities of the Aegean. Carthage is often remembered as a power that stretched across coasts and seas. Yet, for much of its history, its diplomacy was cautious, rather than endlessly expanding. In regions that were densely settled and politically organized, Carthaginian leaders usually preferred influence through trade, alliances, and controlled footholds instead of outright conquest. There was, however, a dramatic exception early on. In 480 BCE, Carthage stepped into the turbulent rivalries of the Greek cities in Sicily and met catastrophe at Himera, where its forces suffered a crushing defeat. For a long time afterward, the Western Phoenician capital avoided large-scale confrontation. That restraint did not last forever. In 410 BCE, Carthage returned to Sicilian affairs when it supported Segesta, an allied city under pressure, and the conflict quickly took on a harsher tone. What began as assistance became a campaign charged with memory and retaliation. Carthage won major victories, including the destruction of Himera, and the settlement that followed confirmed its grip on the western portion of the island. During the 4th century BCE, Sicily remained the central arena of struggle, largely because successive rulers of Syracuse tried again and again to push Carthage out. Several major wars erupted in cycles. and the frontier between the two spheres was repeatedly drawn along a river line in the island's interior. In most campaigns, Carthage relied heavily on hired soldiers, rather than mass citizen levies, which meant that the city itself rarely absorbed the direct human cost of prolonged warfare. Even so, the Sicilian struggle produced one moment of real danger for Carthage on its own soil. In 310 BCE, with Syracuse under intense pressure at home, its ruler launched a bold counterstroke, an invasion of Africa. It was the first time Carthage faced an enemy army in its North African heartland. For 3 years, the invaders devastated territory in what is now eastern Tunisia, burning, plundering, and shaking the confidence of the countryside. In the end, the attack collapsed, and the invaders withdrew defeated. But the episode revealed a vulnerability that sea power and coastal fortresses could not fully erase. Behind the walls lay an empire with many layers. Outsiders accused Carthage of squeezing its subjects with heavy tribute and harsh administration, and the reality varied sharply depending on who was being ruled. The communities treated most favourably were the older Phoenician settlements and the towns founded by Carthage itself. Among these, resistance seems to have been limited, not necessarily because they loved Carthage, but because they shared institutions, customs, and a familiar political culture. They paid customs dues, contributed ships and sailors, and supplied troops when required. Yet, they also benefited from commercial stability and a shared maritime network. In Sicily, non-Carthaginian groups living under Punic authority could receive practical advantages, especially in economic life. For a time, many cities continued to trade with relative freedom and even minted their own coinage. Later, some Greek communities in Sicily became tributaries, handing over a portion of their agricultural produce in exchange for peace and predictable terms. The harshest burdens fell most often on the Libyan populations of the interior. Large-scale enslavement was not the norm everywhere, but the demands placed on these communities could be severe. Agricultural tribute could reach levels that made survival difficult, and military service was constant. Over time, Libyans formed one of the largest elements within Carthage's armies, particularly as light infantry, and payment was not always guaranteed in a modern sense. Before the great wars with Rome, rewards could depend on loot, patronage, or the uncertain promises of commanders. Ancient critics painted a picture of officials competing to extract the greatest supplies and enforce the harshest discipline. Whether every detail of this hostile portrait is fair or not, it fits a broader pattern. When Carthage experienced crisis, the countryside often paid first. That tension exploded after Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War. The conflict ended, but the city's financial strain did not. Mercenaries who expected wages found themselves unpaid, and the result was a revolt that quickly grew into a wider disaster. Over several years, rebel forces controlled much of Carthage's North African territory, and brutality followed on both sides. Libyan communities joined the uprising in large numbers, and their participation suggests that long-standing grievances had reached a breaking point. In the chaos, rebels even struck coinage that named Libyans directly, hinting at a sharpening sense of collective identity. Yet even amid resentment and violence, Carthaginian influence left deep marks. Tools, goods, building styles, and patterns of settlement across the interior increasingly reflected Punic models, showing how domination could transform daily life even when it provoked resistance. Inside Carthage itself, political power evolved over time. Older traditions spoke of kings, and external observers continued to describe a kind of kingship. But the reality appears to have shifted away from simple hereditary rule. In practice, political leadership became increasingly dominated by elite families and councils. By the later centuries of Carthage's independence, the state was led by annually chosen magistrates drawn from the wealthy classes, while long-serving councils of leading citizens handled the most important decisions. A special body of judges held serious authority over officials and institutions, operating as a formidable check within the system. Military command, meanwhile, gradually became separated from civil leadership. Generals could be powerful and were sometimes viewed with suspicion, yet the record does not show them turning armies into tools for seizing the city itself. Carthage feared the danger of ambitious commanders, but its political structure seems to have prevented the kind of coups that were common elsewhere. The army also changed in character. Early on, Carthage likely relied more on citizen levies, as many city-states did. But a small population could not defend far-flung coastal stations and fight repeated wars abroad. Over time, Carthage built a military machine based on mercenaries commanded by Carthaginian officers, with citizen contingents appearing only on special occasions. Different peoples were recruited for different roles. Libyans were valued for light infantry, while horsemen from the lands later called Numidia and Mauritania became famous for fast cavalry. Warriors from Iberia served both as infantry and riders, and later recruits included Gauls, Campanians, and even Greeks. Mercenary armies carried obvious risks, especially when money ran short. Yet they allowed Carthage to absorb losses that a citizen army could never have endured through decades of campaigning. Sea power supported the system. The Carthaginian fleet was not always technologically superior to Greek rivals, but it could be larger, and it drew on experienced sailors from maritime communities spread across the Punic world. Much of Carthage's physical presence was erased after its destruction by Rome in 146 BCE. A new city rose later on the same ground, and the earlier Phoenician city became difficult to reconstruct in detail. Still, fragments of its design are known. Its harbour complex, famous in antiquity, included a commercial basin and an inner circular dockyard, reserved for warships, with ship sheds and quays that could serve a vast fleet. The limited size of the harbour suggests careful seasonal use, especially during months when long-distance sailing slowed. The defensive walls were formidable, and the most vulnerable land approach across the isthmus was heavily fortified. On the hill of Byrsa, the citadel stood as a stronghold, and between that height and the harbours lay the crowded civic core, markets, administrative buildings, and temples. The city's streets were likely narrow and winding, lined by tall houses whose blank outer walls hid inner courtyards. Ancient estimates of the population vary wildly, and the highest figures probably included surrounding districts. But even conservative guesses point to a metropolis comparable to the largest cities of the Greek world, filled with citizens, foreigners, and slaves. Religion shaped Carthaginian identity with an intensity that outsiders often found unsettling. The city's chief divine protector was Baal Hammon, whom Greeks and Romans associated with their own older gods, and over time a powerful goddess, Tanit, rose to wide prominence in worship and art. Her cult carried strong associations with fertility and protection, and her popularity may reflect deeper ties between Punic settlers and inland communities. Other gods remained important as well, especially those linked to the Phoenician homeland. Yet two names dominated the public imagination. The most controversial element of Carthaginian religion in ancient accounts was the practice of human sacrifice. The ritual, centered on offerings to Baal and preserved longer in Africa than in the eastern Phoenician world, left an archaeological footprint in cemeteries, where cremated remains were placed in urns and marked by stone monuments. Similar evidence appears not only at Carthage but across Punic sites throughout the Western Mediterranean. The broader religious worldview conveyed by these practices emphasized human fragility before divine forces that were believed to be powerful, unpredictable, and demanding. Even personal names often carried religious meaning, as though faith was stitched into daily identity. Carthage's cultural legacy is uneven. Considering the scale of its wealth and influence, the surviving traces of its art and intellectual life appear modest. Many buildings that remain are practical rather than monumental, and the decorative arts often borrow heavily from Phoenician, Egyptian, and Greek styles without producing an unmistakable local school of genius. This does not mean the city lacked learning. Many inhabitants in later centuries knew Greek, libraries existed, and at least one major written work is remembered. An agricultural treatise attributed to a Punic author named Mago. Yet the overall impression is of a society that valued continuity and cohesion more than experimentation, holding tightly to inherited ways of thinking, while surrounded by rival powers. By the 3rd and 2nd centuries, before the present era, Carthage was no longer the confident maritime giant that had once controlled key routes across the western Mediterranean. Its long rivalry with Rome, a power rising fast on the Italian peninsula, turned into a sequence of wars that steadily drained Carthage's strength and ended with its destruction. Earlier agreements between the two states had helped keep relations stable for generations, because their interests rarely collided. That balance began to break once Rome secured control over southern Italy and inevitably drew close to the Carthaginian zone of influence in Sicily. The island had always been a sensitive hinge between powers, and a single change there could tilt the entire western Mediterranean. The spark came when Rome accepted the submission of Messana on Sicily's northeastern edge, a city that had recently hosted Carthaginian forces. Roman leaders framed the decision as a defensive necessity. Convinced that Carthaginian influence might threaten Italy itself, but the move also offered Rome an entry point into a region it had never truly dominated. Carthage saw the Roman foothold as a direct challenge to the old Sicilian balance. War followed, and the first conflict between them became a brutal test of endurance. Fighting dragged on for more than 2 decades, and naval battles in particular produced shocking losses. Rome, which began the war with limited experience at sea, built a fleet and learned quickly, defeating Carthaginian squadrons in encounters that many would have considered improbable at the outset. On land, Roman armies could not fully drive Carthaginian forces out of Sicily, and one dramatic Roman attempt to carry the war into North Africa ended in disaster. Eventually, Carthage sued for peace after a final defeat at sea, abandoning its position in Sicily. Soon after, Rome added Sardinia and Corsica to its holdings, tightening the pressure and shrinking Carthage's reach. Carthage responded not by collapsing inward, but by turning westward. A new strategy took shape under Hamilcar Barca and the leaders who followed him, a group later remembered as a single political and military circle. The goal was to build a power base in Spain that could replace what had been lost and provide what Carthage now needed most: direct access to mineral wealth and a deep pool of manpower. Instead of relying on distant trade and middlemen, Carthage sought to control mines, routes, and recruiting grounds. Over time, a large field army was assembled from Iberian communities, and Carthaginian influence spread over wide portions of the peninsula. A new empire was being built in the west, not as a mere extension of old trading posts, but as a deliberate counterweight to Rome's growing land power. Tensions rose as this Spanish base expanded. Roman leaders issued warnings designed to halt further consolidation. But the Carthaginian commander, Hannibal, chose to press forward. His decision carried the conflict into its most dramatic phase. Crossing into Italy, he inflicted a series of defeats so severe that Rome faced the darkest crisis in its history. Entire Roman armies were shattered in battles that became bywords for catastrophe. Yet Rome did not collapse. Its network of Italian allies and dependent communities, expected by many to defect under pressure, largely remained loyal. That loyalty proved decisive. Hannibal's victories did not translate into the steady reinforcements and supplies required for a final blow. As years passed, it became harder for him to sustain the campaign, and the war's momentum began to shift away from the invader. Rome struck back where Carthage was most vulnerable, its new Spanish foundation. Roman commanders methodically dismantled Carthaginian authority there, cutting off resources and forcing withdrawals. When Spain was effectively stripped from Carthage's control, a Roman army landed in North Africa near the old Phoenician heartland. The war that had raged for years on Italian soil now threatened Carthage directly. Hannibal was recalled to defend his city's fate, but the final confrontation ended in defeat. Carthage sued for peace under harsh terms. It surrendered its fleet, lost its overseas possessions, and gave up parts of its African territory. The Second Great Conflict ended not only a campaign, but the possibility that Carthage could remain an equal rival to Rome. For a generation afterward, Carthage still showed signs of recovery. Commerce continued, agriculture remained productive, and the city did not instantly fade into poverty. But the political environment had turned hostile. A powerful Numidian kingdom to the west and south pressed constantly on Carthaginian lands, and Rome watched with suspicion. In Rome itself, fear took on a life of its own. A belief spread that Carthage might rise again if left alone, even when evidence for such a revival was thin. When Rome finally demanded that the Carthaginians abandon their city and resettle inland, the demand was understood as a sentence of cultural death. Carthage chose resistance. A siege followed, long and exhausting, and when the walls finally fell, the city was destroyed. The site was marked by ritual gestures meant to underline finality, as if Rome wanted the memory of Carthage to end alongside its buildings. While Carthage was locked in its struggle with Rome, the eastern edge of North Africa followed a different rhythm. Cyrenaica, facing the open sea toward Crete and the Aegean, belonged to another network of contacts. Long before Greek settlers arrived, its coast was visited by seafarers and fishermen, and the region's position made it a natural bridge between Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. When Greek communities looked for new land, Cyrenaica stood out as one of the few North African coasts not already dominated by a major colonial power. Pressure in the Greek world, including overcrowding on small islands, pushed settlers toward this opportunity. A new city was founded in a fertile zone near the foothills of Green Mountains, close enough to the sea for access, yet far enough inland to claim reliable water and rich soil. Early relations between settlers and local communities could be cooperative. Intermarriage occurred more often than in many other Greek colonies, and the initial period suggests negotiation, rather than immediate conquest. As prosperity increased, more settlers arrived, and competition over land intensified. Conflict followed, and the newcomers established stronger control. The city also faced external challenges, including an invasion from Egypt that it managed to repel, and later it accepted submission to a great imperial power from the east. Even so, it did not remain isolated. Additional Greek cities appeared across the region, each developing its own identity rather than functioning as mere satellites. In the 6th century before the present era, Cyrenaica's wealth became visible in temple building, public works, and expanding farmland. Its prosperity rested on grain, fruit, horses, and especially a prized medicinal plant. Harvested, traded widely. A resource so valuable that it became part of the region's reputation. Political life shifted over time. A ruling dynasty ended, and new constitutional arrangements emerged that echoed the broader Greek world's experiments with civic government. Despite internal tensions, the region's economy remained strong through much of the 4th century. When the Macedonian conquest reshaped the eastern Mediterranean, Cyrenaica entered the orbit of the rulers of Egypt, yet local cities continued to manage many of their own affairs. Forms of government blended oligarchy and civic participation, with councils and large citizen bodies shaping decisions. In the following centuries, urban life reorganized. Ports grew in importance, cities were refounded under new names, and administrative reforms encouraged closer coordination among the major towns. Eventually, the group of 5 principal cities became a recognized unit, a convenient label for an urban landscape that had grown dense and interconnected. Cyrenaica entered Roman control through inheritance rather than conquest, at least in its first phase. Rome initially annexed royal estates while leaving cities significant freedom. Disorder and faction later prompted tighter administration, and a formal province emerged. Even then, rule was not static. The province's boundaries and status changed according to Roman political needs, and at one point it was granted as a personal possession before being restored to standard provincial governance. Through these transitions, Cyrenaica remained a zone where Greek civic traditions persisted under new imperial umbrellas, producing a layered identity that was neither purely Greek nor purely Roman. After Carthage's fall, the western Maghreb moved through an in-between era. Rome now held decisive power, yet it did not immediately impose full control over the interior. In the space between the destruction of the old Punic capital and the later consolidation of Roman rule, native kingdoms rose to prominence. The labels used for these peoples shift across sources and eras, but broad groupings can still be seen. One cluster occupied land stretching from the Atlantic toward major river systems in the west, giving their name to a kingdom remembered for its coastal and inland zones. Another group occupied regions closer to the former Carthaginian sphere, while desert and fringe peoples remained more mobile and harder for outsiders to categorize. These societies were not frozen in time. Their contact with Carthaginian civilization had already begun changing political structures, wealth, and burial customs, and service in Carthaginian armies helped introduce new practices and expectations. Monumental tombs built for elites, visible even today as massive earthen and stone structures, point to growing social hierarchy and new forms of authority. The transformation was especially striking in Numidia, where one leader became emblematic of change. Massinissa, raised within the orbit of Carthage and shaped by its political world, entered history as a young man during the great struggle between Rome and Carthage. His early alliances shifted with the pressure of war and rival tribes, and he spent years fighting far from home in Spain. When the tide turned and Roman forces landed in North Africa, he became a crucial ally, providing cavalry and local knowledge that strengthened the Roman campaign. In return, he was recognized as king and expanded his realm at the expense of rivals. His reign lasted for decades and is remembered as a period of consolidation and economic development. Ancient observers described him as turning nomads into farmers. An exaggeration in detail, but the larger reality stands. Cultivation expanded, and the infrastructure of settled life grew stronger. This change was not only about fields and harvests. Massinissa encouraged Punic techniques and cultural forms to spread inland. Language, religious ideas, artistic styles, and urban practices moved with merchants, craftsmen, and refugees. His capital took on the appearance of a Punic-style city, and other settlements likely began shifting from loosely organized villages toward more urban patterns. Coinage appeared for local use, suggesting a more complex economy and a stronger state presence in daily exchange. After Massinissa's death, Rome preferred division over unity, and his kingdom was split among heirs, then later reunited, then split again during later successions. Despite these political fractures, the broader direction continued. Refugees from destroyed Carthage brought skills and networks into Numidia, deepening urban and agricultural growth. Rome's own approach in the region was cautious at first. A province was created in the northeastern corner of Tunisia, but Rome showed limited interest in fully exploiting the interior's resources. Attempts to found major colonies struggled, and much of Rome's presence remained indirect, built through land grants to veterans, the spread of merchants, and the slow expansion of influence rather than immediate state building. Yet the situation could not remain stable forever. Internal disputes in Numidia and Roman meddling produced conflict, most famously when Jugurtha emerged as a dominant figure. His rise might have been tolerated, but violence involving Italian merchants made war unavoidable. Early Roman failures, driven by poor leadership and corruption, allowed Jugurtha initial successes. But in the end, he was betrayed and captured through the actions of a neighbouring king. Numidia survived under new rulers, tied to the old royal line, while Roman influence deepened along key valleys and roads. By the 1st century before the present era, the last strong Numidian king found himself caught in Rome's civil wars. He chose a side, and when that side lost, his kingdom fell with it. Rome reorganized the territory into new provincial structures, then merged them into a larger administrative unit. In the West, another kingdom was handled differently. When a king died, leaving his realm to Rome, the imperial leadership hesitated to accept direct responsibility for a vast and comparatively less integrated region. Instead, a client king was installed. Juba II, educated in the Mediterranean cultural world and linked by marriage to a royal line associated with Egypt. Under his rule, coastal and inland capitals became centres of late Hellenistic culture, with architecture, learning, and court life reflecting the tastes of the wider Mediterranean. Juba himself wrote extensively in Greek on subjects ranging from geography to history, presenting his kingdom as part of an international intellectual world, rather than a distant frontier. After Rome destroyed Carthage, its first North African foothold was surprisingly small. For more than a century, the new province, focused mainly on the fertile lands that roughly match modern Tunisia, was administered from Utica and treated as a secondary posting. A low-ranking Roman official could manage it because Rome's priorities lay elsewhere. Over time, however, the region's value became harder to ignore. Under Augustus, administration was reshaped to match that growing importance. Carthage was rebuilt as a Roman colony and turned into the seat of power, and the governor was upgraded to a proconsul based in the refounded city. His authority stretched across a far wider zone, reaching from the western boundary near the Ampsaga River, all the way toward the frontier of Cyrenaica. This arrangement produced an unusual balance inside the Roman system. The proconsul not only governed civilian affairs, but also held command over the African army. Yet he remained formally responsible to the Senate rather than to the emperor. Rome rarely allowed that combination of military power and senatorial accountability, and it did not last indefinitely. In the 1st century of the imperial era, the military side of the province was separated from the proconsul's hands and entrusted to an imperial appointee of praetorian rank. Even before the region was officially subdivided later on, this change meant that the army commander effectively controlled the inland military zone that would later be treated as a separate territory. The proconsul's role became a prestigious but short appointment, often only a year reserved for men who had already reached the highest political rank. The post was so prominent that several governors later rose to the imperial throne. By contrast, army commanders stayed longer, commonly 2 or 3 years, and the African command became a recognized step for ambitious officers building reputations. West of this core province, the 2 Mauritanian provinces were handled differently. Their governors came from the equestrian class and combined civilian authority with command of large numbers of auxiliary troops. When danger flared, Rome sometimes placed both provinces under a single leader for faster coordination. Even so, the security problems of North Africa were rarely comparable to those along the empire's northern edge. The greatest difficulty did not come from powerful rival states, but from tribal groups living on the desert fringe and beyond. As farming and town life expanded toward the limit of cultivable land, Rome found itself managing constant movement, seasonal migration, grazing routes, and the unpredictable pressure of nomadic raiders. Most conflicts were small, but a few forced serious responses. One major revolt in southern Tunisia required prolonged campaigning before order was restored. As settlement pushed outward, the army's footprint shifted with it. Legionary headquarters moved step by step, following the zone where control mattered most. A base that once sat in Tunisia was relocated westward to key positions, eventually settling in what is now Algeria. This was not simply military logistics, it reflected an expanding frontier society. Tribal territories were reduced and marked out with increasing precision, and Rome pressed many groups toward settled life by narrowing their access to pasture and controlling wells and routes. Local communities were placed under Roman supervisors, officials who acted as intermediaries and watchdogs, and the empire built a chain of forts to shape the boundary between cultivated land and open range. Under Trajan, a more coherent southern frontier emerged. Mountain zones were ringed and contained, and forts were linked into a defensive line that controlled travel and supply. Some mountainous regions were entered and pacified, yet they were never fully remade into Roman-style landscapes. In the 2nd century, long stretches of earthworks, ditches and walls in places, added another layer of control, not only blocking movement, but also making a visible statement about where the settled world ended and the nomadic world began. Southwest of the mountain belt, Rome extended a fortified zone to complete a broader frontier system. For a time, outposts reached exceptionally far south in the Algerian interior. And farther east, in Libya, forts were planted along trans-Saharan routes, following the logic of caravan travel rather than dense settlement. These were not grand walls like those imagined in distant provinces. They were practical points of control, forts near routes, stations near water, and garrisons positioned to watch the edges of Roman influence. In the Mauritanian lands, the task was harder. The terrain was rougher, distances longer, and the relationship between coast and interior more complicated. Rome used a familiar method, containing mountain regions by encircling them, applying it to ranges in northern Algeria much as it had done farther east. Some zones, especially around certain interior towns, were successfully developed in the 2nd century. But the western reaches long remained shaped mainly by the coast and by military roads rather than deep inland transformation. A major route linked strategic points through the interior and down into river valleys, and the frontier line was adjusted southward across a broad arc. Beyond this, permanent overland connections were uncertain. Sea travel often remained the simplest way to link distant districts. In the far west of Roman Morocco, control extended only to a limited inland belt. Important towns were held, and Roman officials maintained contact with chiefs beyond the boundary, suggesting negotiation and diplomacy more than constant war. Yet mountain tribes could still live in near independence, and periodic outbreaks of conflict occurred over successive reigns. These wars were disruptive but rarely existential. They did not devastate the main urban zones and did not force Rome to permanently increase its North African garrison. When the numbers are considered, the contrast with other frontiers is striking. North Africa could be secured with relatively modest forces, one legion and supporting troops for the inland military zone, and auxiliary units for the western provinces. Elsewhere in the empire, far larger armies were required to hold less economically productive territory. By the middle of the 2nd century, much of the African garrison was recruited locally, which further tied military service to provincial society and made the army less of an external occupying force and more of a local institution. The most visible outcome of Roman rule in North Africa was not a dramatic series of wars, but the spread of towns and a prosperous urban culture. In Tunisia, northern Algeria, and selected parts of Morocco, cities flourished at a scale that would have been hard to imagine earlier. Several conditions made this possible. Pastoral and nomadic movement was increasingly managed, reducing the instability that discouraged permanent investment. Large areas of thinly settled but potentially rich land could now be exploited more consistently. Earlier developments also mattered. Punic influence and the policies of Numidian rulers had already begun pushing parts of the interior toward more complex settlement and production. Roman power accelerated what was already forming. Italian immigrants played a role, even if they were never the majority. Veterans were settled in colonies, especially in coastal towns, and individual entrepreneurs followed them. Military adventurers and their followers could reshape whole districts, bringing Roman legal habits and Latin-speaking communities into areas that had previously been organized in very different ways. Plans to rebuild Carthage were finally carried out, and the colony expanded rapidly because its location made it a natural hub for sea routes, connecting Africa with Italy. Other colonies were planted deeper inland, and additional foundations appeared along the Mauritanian coast. Some were veteran settlements, created under emperors who favoured colonization as a way to stabilize strategic points. Others were new towns in the interior laid out near roads, farmland, and garrison zones. The army itself became one of the strongest engines of cultural spread. Forts drew markets, markets drew craftsmen, and workshops drew families. Around these nodes, frontier districts could slowly take on an urban character. Alongside Roman colonies, a large number of native communities were recognized by the administration. Many were small villages or clan-based units, yet Rome's system allowed local autonomy, and that autonomy provided room for growth. Over time, some communities accumulated enough wealth and stability to be granted higher status and, eventually, Roman citizenship. These grants were not only legal favours, they acted like official stamps of approval, signalling that a settlement had become reliable, prosperous, and culturally aligned with Roman expectations. Coastal towns with older Punic roots often advanced early, especially where Italian settlers also arrived. Certain major cities gained full colonial rank, and throughout the 2nd century, the list of upgraded towns expanded. Imperial visits and the favour of rulers with African ties further stimulated this process. When Septimius Severus, a man rooted in a prominent family from Leptis Magna, became emperor, North Africa gained a powerful patron who understood the region's ambitions and rewarded its elites. Romanization in the Maghreb did not rest on pre-existing city aristocracies of the kind seen in parts of the Greek East. Nor did it simply overlay strong tribal nobility, as in some Western provinces. Instead, it often depended on smaller local leaders, clan heads, village notables, ambitious individuals working within the incentives Rome offered. Land ownership patterns also differed from Italy. Early on, some large estates belonged to absentee senators, but many of these holdings later passed into imperial control. Over time, substantial landowners were more often resident in the province, both immigrant and indigenous, and many lived in towns where they served as municipal leaders. Small independent farmers existed, but the backbone of agricultural production was made up of tenant cultivators. Many worked under sharecropping arrangements and owed labour obligations to landlords. Slaves were present, but the agricultural workforce appears to have relied less heavily on mass slavery than in parts of Italy. As towns grew richer, Africans entered the wider machinery of empire. An African reached the consulship under Vespasian, and by the early 3rd century, men from the region filled a notable share of equestrian administrative posts and formed a significant bloc in the Senate. Many were likely of mixed background, reflecting a province where identities blended over generations. Punic heritage, Libyan roots, and Roman citizenship intersecting in complicated ways. In the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, the urban elites expressed their status through public generosity. Theatres, baths, temples, and monumental arches rose through local funding, while statues, feasts, and public distributions created civic spectacle. This pattern existed across the empire, but North Africa provides exceptionally clear evidence of it. In city after city, competition for honour pushed leading families to spend lavishly, and the landscape of the Maghreb was reshaped into one of the empire's most densely urbanized and economically active provincial regions. The crowded map of Roman North Africa can be misleading. A tight cluster of towns does not mean an economy driven mainly by workshops or long-distance commerce. Most communities were, at heart, agricultural settlements. Town life and countryside life were intertwined. Landowners lived behind city walls. Peasants lived near their fields, and market squares mainly served the rhythms of planting and harvest. The wealth of the region rose from grain lands, orchards, and olive groves, not from factories. By the early imperial period, African grain had become essential to Rome's food supply. Vast quantities crossed the sea each year, feeding the capital and supporting both public distributions and private trade. Some of that grain flowed through imperial estates and tax systems, but a large share was bought and sold in open markets, moved by shippers, merchants, and contractors who treated North Africa as one of the Mediterranean's great breadbaskets. Estimates of production vary, but the picture remains consistent. Output was enormous and exports were substantial. Grain fields concentrated in specific zones, fertile peninsulas, river valleys, and broad stretches of level land where cereals could be grown at scale. Wheat and barley dominated, yet the countryside did not rely on a single crop. Vines and fig trees were common, and beans and other staples filled out diets and local trade. Over time, another product rose to rival grain in importance. Olive oil expanded from a valuable regional commodity into an export on an imperial scale. By the 2nd century, it had become a cornerstone of the economy in many districts, especially in southern Tunisia and along the northern slopes of mountain ranges in Algeria. By the 4th century, African oil was reaching consumers across the empire, packed and shipped in containers, made for bulk transport. This success required more than good soil. Olives, in particular, demanded careful control of water. The archaeological landscape preserves clear traces of that effort: channels, cisterns, terraces, and managed catchments designed to collect and distribute limited rainfall. The countryside shows a mindset of long planning and steady maintenance, especially in areas where the climate could easily punish neglect. Water management was not a decorative achievement. It was the practical foundation that allowed oil production to spread into zones where the harvest would otherwise have been unreliable. Animal husbandry also mattered, even if it leaves fewer obvious traces. African horses became famous in the spectacles of the Roman world, prized for racing and valued for military use as well. Herds of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and mules supported transport and daily life. The region also supplied a darker kind of commodity: wild animals captured for shows in Rome and other major cities. Big cats and other exotic creatures were taken from African landscapes and shipped north, turning local ecology into a resource for imperial entertainment. Along the coasts, fishing remained vigorous, continuing traditions that had already been established in earlier centuries. Forests along parts of the northern shore provided timber, while quarries produced marble that travelled widely, giving North Africa a place not only in food supply, but also in building and decoration across the Mediterranean. Industry, however, remained limited by ancient standards. No huge manufacturing districts dominated the region. Pottery was the major exception, and even that industry was closely tied to agriculture, because containers were needed to move food products. As oil exports expanded, amphora production grew into a substantial enterprise, and African wares circulated widely in Mediterranean ports. Luxury, in a different sense, appears most clearly in the homes of the wealthy. Mosaic floors became a fashionable expression of status, and thousands have been found, ranging from rough local work to pieces of remarkable skill. Most were made by regional craftsmen, although patterns and ideas moved between provinces, and local workshops adapted designs that originated elsewhere. Building itself was another major employer. Construction required engineers, masons, carpenters, tile makers, haulers, and unskilled labour. In many towns, the building trades were the largest engines of paid work outside farming. Prosperity in the first 2 centuries of the imperial era likely drove population growth. Exact figures remain uncertain, but estimates suggest millions of inhabitants across the Maghreb, with Tunisia holding a particularly dense share. A striking proportion lived in towns, although town, in this context, often meant a community that blended urban identity with agricultural function. Carthage stood far above the rest as a true metropolis. Behind it came a smaller tier of major coastal and inland cities, and then a wide mesh of mid-sized towns close enough to one another to form a lived-in landscape rather than isolated islands of stone. In some valleys, towns of several thousand people appeared at short intervals, linked by roads, markets, and shared farmland. Those roads were among the most developed networks in the Western Empire. Many began as military lines, but they quickly served commerce and administration. Main routes radiated from Carthage toward legionary bases, inland capitals, and coastal ports. Secondary roads filled the gaps, often built and maintained by local communities, that had strong incentives to link themselves into the larger economy. Carthage handled the heaviest overseas traffic, not only because of its political importance, but also because it sat naturally beside the wealthiest agricultural districts. Yet the practical logic of shipping meant that grain and oil often moved to the nearest workable port, rather than travelling long distances by cart. Coastal towns founded in earlier periods expanded under Roman rule, taking advantage of steady production inland and reliable demand across the sea. In the 3rd century, the empire entered a period of severe instability. External attacks struck northern and eastern frontiers. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, and civil wars disrupted trade and taxation. Africa weathered this storm better than many regions, but it was not untouched. A revolt by landowners broke out in response to harsh fiscal pressure and ended in widespread damage. Mountain and desert fringe regions saw repeated tribal unrest over several decades, and at the end of the century the situation drew personal attention from an emperor who campaigned to restore order. The most urbanized areas rarely faced direct destruction from these revolts, yet the wider economic stress, especially inflation and uncertainty, hit towns hard. Building slowed, public spending declined, and confidence faltered. Stability returned gradually with the reorganization of imperial government and the army at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th. Administrative boundaries were redrawn. The old province centered on Carthage was split into smaller units, with Tripolitania focused on the Libyan coast around Leptis Magna, a new province covering southern Tunisia governed from Hadramautum, and a northern Tunisian province that retained Carthage as its capital. Elsewhere, eastern Mauritania was reorganized as a separate province. In the far west, Rome pulled back from some inland districts, apparently because the cost of holding them outweighed the benefit under constant pressure from local tribes. At the same time, military structure changed. A mobile field army in Africa was placed under a commander independent of civilian governors, while frontier troops were organized as local garrisons, stationed along desert and mountain edges. These frontier soldiers were often recruited from nearby farming communities and lived closely bound to the land they defended. In some exposed zones, fortified farms multiplied, creating a landscape where agriculture and defense fused into a single system. The later empire also tightened its grip on society. Large landowners gained power over tenants and small farmers, while the state tried to prevent people from escaping tax obligations by tying them to land and occupation. Urban councils, once sought after by the wealthy as paths to honour, became heavy burdens. Duties that had earlier been voluntary turned into obligations that rulers tried to make hereditary. Many councillors looked for ways out through imperial service, legal professions, or church offices, anything that offered immunity. This pressure is clearly visible in Africa, yet the idea of a simple urban collapse does not fit the evidence. Several towns maintained vitality, and some even grew, especially those with strong agricultural bases and relative insulation from war damage. A town could thrive if its countryside remained productive, its roads stayed open, and it avoided the worst shocks that struck other provinces. During this same period, Christianity expanded in North Africa with exceptional speed. By the 3rd century, it had become firmly rooted in Carthage and other towns, producing its own martyrs and powerful writers whose style and arguments shaped Latin Christianity for generations. Councils drew large numbers of bishops, including representatives from distant frontier districts, showing how deeply the religion had penetrated provincial society. Over the next decades, it spread widely in Numidia as well, and the reasons for its rapid growth have long been debated. Urban life helped, since cities offered the same social networks that had carried the faith earlier in the Eastern Mediterranean. Smaller communities also adopted it, and in many places the new religion interacted with older local traditions, rather than simply replacing them. African Christianity, from early on, displayed a fierce energy, especially in its devotion to martyrdom and moral rigour, even though the evidence for organised missionary campaigns is limited. When imperial policy shifted in favour of Christianity, the African churches found themselves both empowered and divided. A dispute over a bishop's legitimacy turned into a long-running schism. One side claimed the official church leadership in Carthage had been compromised during persecution and therefore lacked true spiritual authority. The other side held recognition from wider church councils and, crucially, from the emperor. The result was not a minor quarrel, but a split that lasted for more than a century. Many communities, especially in parts of Numidia, followed the rival leadership and insisted that they alone represented the true church of the martyrs. Imperial support flowed to the official church buildings were sometimes seized, and violence flared. Yet repression did not end the movement. At times, imperial policy softened, exiled leaders returned, and the schism regained strength. Over the decades, laws were issued against the dissidents, but enforcement was inconsistent, shaped by local politics and by the weakening reach of central authority. In the early 5th century, the struggle entered a decisive phase. A major church leader, based in Hippo Regius, used extraordinary skill in argument, persuasion, and organization to push for stronger state action, while also developing the idea that rulers could legitimately use force to preserve religious unity. An imperial conference in Carthage was staged to settle the matter, and the outcome was predictable. The dissidents were condemned. The laws that followed were more firmly applied than before, and the movement was gradually broken as a mass force, even if pockets survived for a long time. The meaning of this schism has been argued over ever since. Some interpretations treat it as a social or regional protest, stronger among rural workers and less Romanized communities, while the official church is cast as the faith of urban elites and Roman administration. Others point out that the reality was messier. The dissidents were strong in towns as well as countryside. Their debates were conducted in Latin, and educated classes could be found on both sides. The movement did not create a separate vernacular literature, nor did it clearly reject the imperial system as a whole. It fought through courts, petitions, and official channels as much as through street-level confrontation. Yet it did reflect something deep within African Christianity, an uncompromising devotion to martyr memory, strict ideas of purity, and a refusal to accept leadership that seemed tainted by past weakness. That spirit linked the movement to the earlier heroic age of persecution, when steadfastness and suffering had been central to Christian identity. All of this ties into a wider question about Romanization. In the Maghreb, was Roman culture only a thin layer over a largely unchanged society, or did it reshape the majority in lasting ways? The question is complicated by later history, since Latin language and Roman Christianity did not survive in the same way they did in parts of Europe. In mountain regions, local languages and customs remained resilient, even though Christianity spread widely by the 7th century. Elsewhere, older Punic and Libyan traditions persisted and influenced how Roman ways were adopted. A late form of Punic speech survived in some areas into the 4th century, and a Libyan script appears on funerary stones, though it fades from the record over time. At the same time, Latin became broadly used across much of the Maghreb, especially in towns and administrative life, and it is difficult to pinpoint a clear social boundary where Latin was unknown. Christianity, whether aligned with the imperial church or with dissident communities, seems to have pushed Latin even further, because worship, argument, and organization depended heavily on it. The result was a province where Roman civilization was both widespread and uneven, powerful in the plains and towns, weaker in some mountains and fringe zones, and always filtered through older local traditions that shaped what being Roman could mean in North Africa. The long struggle inside African Christianity left marks that are hard to quantify in account books or official reports, but the shockwaves were real. Arguments over legitimacy, purity, and authority consumed energy, shaped loyalties, and pulled communities into rival networks that extended from village churches to imperial courts. And just as one side finally achieved a decisive victory, the wider world that had sustained Roman order was beginning to collapse. In the early 5th century, pressure built along the empire's frontiers, and a chain reaction followed. Large confederations crossed into Roman territory, carving through provinces that had once been considered secure. Gaul and Spain were overwhelmed, and Italy itself was invaded. When Rome was sacked, it was not only a dramatic symbol. It revealed that the Western imperial government could no longer guarantee protection, even at the heart of its own myth. For a short time, North Africa remained outside the worst of the storm. The sea acted like a moat, and geography bought the region a little time. But Africa's importance increased precisely because other areas were falling away. The grain and tax revenue of the African provinces became a lifeline for what remained of imperial authority in the West. Whoever controlled Africa could feed armies, pay officials, and keep a fragile state breathing. That made the military commanders stationed there more powerful than ever before, and it also tempted them. When central government weakens, frontier leaders often discover that loyalty can be negotiated. In that atmosphere, intrigue grew. One commander, Boniface, was later accused of calling for outside help to strengthen his own position. But the deeper forces mattered more than any single invitation. North Africa was wealthy, defensible, and politically valuable. It was exactly the kind of target that an ambitious migrating people would seek, with or without a formal pretext. The Vandals were already positioned in southern Spain when they turned toward Africa. Under their king, Gaiseric, the movement became a full-scale transfer of a people, rather than a mere raid. Tens of thousands crossed the sea and pushed eastward with speed that shocked Roman planners. Resistance was inconsistent. Imperial forces were divided. Local defences were uneven, and many cities were not prepared for a long siege. Hippo Regius held out, but after months of pressure it fell. And during that siege, Augustine died, a symbolic end to an era of African Christian leadership. After a Roman defeat near Calama, the Vandals surged across wide areas. Not every fortified city was taken immediately, and some strongholds resisted, but the strategic momentum shifted. Agreements were made, revised, and broken as the situation changed. In the end, Carthage itself was captured and plundered, and that single event transformed a regional crisis into a Mediterranean one. A later settlement recognized Vandal control across key provinces, including the richest coastal zones and large stretches of the interior as far as major inland centers. The Vandals were not uniquely savage compared with other Germanic invaders, despite the later association of their name with mindless destruction. The damage they caused came less from theatrical cruelty and more from structural disruption. When armies move, fields are abandoned, tax systems break, land titles are overturned, and the social ties that bind towns to countryside are cut. Entire districts were ravaged, and the imperial government had to reduce taxes drastically in some western provinces simply because the land could no longer carry the old burdens. In northern Tunisia, many landowners were expelled, and property was redistributed to the newcomers. The peasantry remained the base of agricultural production, but the loss of established elites hit towns hard. In North Africa, wealthy landowners were often the patrons of urban life, paying for public buildings, festivals, repairs, and municipal services. When those families were removed or impoverished, the towns that depended on them weakened as well. Religion sharpened the divide between conquerors and conquered. The Vandals followed an Arian form of Christianity that separated them from the Latin-speaking church of the provinces. Accounts written by their opponents sometimes exaggerate the scale of persecution, but pressure from the Vandal kings was real and at times severe. This was not only a matter of doctrine. African Christianity had a stubborn intensity and deep local roots, and it kept the loyalty of many people who might otherwise have accepted new rulers with little resistance. Even those with little to lose in the replacement of a Roman landlord by a Vandal, one could remain emotionally and socially anchored to the older church. In that sense, religious conflict became a political problem, because it preserved lines of identity that conquest alone could not erase. Gaiseric himself understood the weakness of the Western Empire more clearly than most. Rather than pursuing the safer path of formal partnership with a collapsing authority, he chose a strategy of independent power. A strong fleet, built on the commercial maritime capacity already present in the region, allowed him to project force across the sea. Coastal raids and island seizures followed. Rome was struck again, not because the city still ruled an empire, but because its name remained valuable, and its vulnerability was obvious. Islands and coastlines that mattered for sea lanes were occupied, and raids reached deep into other shores. Trade did not vanish overnight, but the old unity of the Western Mediterranean was being broken into competing zones, each controlled by different powers and increasingly distrustful of the others. The transformation was already underway with the rise of other barbarian kingdoms, yet Vandal sea power accelerated the process by turning shipping routes into contested corridors. After Gaiseric, the kingdom continued but lost some of its sharp edge. His successor, Huneric, launched a wide persecution of the Latin Church, seemingly driven more by religious zeal than by calculated politics. Later, rulers were less extreme, and there are signs that many Vandals began adopting Roman habits of life, language, and taste. Even so, the tribe maintained a distinct identity until the Eastern Empire decided to destroy it. Meanwhile, a quieter but crucial change unfolded inland. In mountain zones and desert fringes, independent kingdoms emerged with a strongly Libyan character. These were not new peoples appearing from nowhere. They were local societies taking advantage of a vacuum, building power where Roman administration had already been weakening and where Vandal control was even thinner. The western frontier, which had previously been pulled back, receded further. New political centres appeared in regions of Algeria, in mountainous ranges and in interior basins. Some towns north of the Ore were attacked and sacked by forces linked to one of these kingdoms. The names of known leaders point to Libyan roots, yet Romanized elements survived inside some realms. Latin epitaphs continued. Roman personal names still appeared, and some communities even kept a dating system based on older provincial foundations. The landscape was becoming layered. Roman forms persisted in pockets, while new local powers expanded around them. At the same time, an older danger returned, with renewed force. Nomadic groups along the edges of Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, already troublesome in earlier centuries, pushed westward. By the end of Vandal rule, they threatened the southern parts of the Tunisian provinces. This movement mattered because it struck at the foundations of settled life itself. Whether a region was ruled by Romans, Vandals, or local kings, farming towns depended on predictable security. When nomadic pressure increased, fields could be abandoned, routes could be cut, and the thin line separating cultivated land from open range could break. North Africa later became central to Justinian's ambition to rebuild Roman power. He aimed to crush the Germanic kingdoms and restore imperial unity, and Africa was one of the first targets. Experts warned him, remembering earlier disasters, but the campaign went forward. Belisarius landed with a relatively small force and benefited from Vandal disorganization. Within a year, the kingdom collapsed. Victory on paper was fast, but control on the ground was not. A new administrative system was imposed, separating civilian governance from military command and placing the region under high officials with layers of subordinate governors and generals. Yet pacifying the countryside took many years. resistance in the Mauritanian regions remained strong, and support from the central government was often inadequate. Soldiers mutinied when pay and supplies failed, and rebuilding authority became a grinding struggle rather than a clean restoration. One response was a massive program of fortification. Under Justinian's officials, fort building accelerated. Some forts were designed to hold frontier zones, and the defensive line expanded again in places, reaching beyond earlier limits for a time. Many surviving towns in the interior were also given strong walls, not because they were new foundations, but because they had become exposed. Stone defences were a way to protect tax bases, store supplies, and keep urban life from collapsing under the pressure of raids. After Justinian died, conflict with Western tribes continued, but some of the most destructive incursions came from nomadic groups, pushing out of desert regions, striking deep into Tunisia on multiple occasions. The restoration also carried a religious agenda. Justinian poured resources into churches, not only rebuilding, but decorating them with a kind of imperial confidence meant to signal that orthodoxy had returned. Any remaining dissident Christians were pressured or persecuted, and the old pluralism of African Christianity was squeezed. Even weakened by earlier decades, the African Church still showed flashes of its old strength, especially when it opposed theological policies coming from Constantinople. Africa could still argue, resist, and lead, even if its political leverage had declined. After Justinian, the story becomes harder to see clearly. Sources thin out, and what remains suggests a slow drift toward militarization. The influence of generals grew, and a new powerful official was introduced, whose authority resembled that of a viceroy. Economic life weakened as insecurity spread and as administration became heavier, often remembered for corruption and extortion. It is difficult to prove that Africa suffered more than other Byzantine lands, but the decline of town populations seems clear. Many cities no longer held anything like their earlier numbers. Constantinople's attention was pulled toward more urgent threats in the Balkans and the East, and Africa was often treated as distant, even though its resources could still be crucial in emergencies. Once, Africa returned to the centre of imperial drama. A revolt began from Carthage when the son of the African exarch sailed east and seized the throne in Constantinople. This moment shows that Africa still had ships, money, and political weight. A few years later, when Persians overran much of the eastern provinces and even took Egypt, Africa again appeared as a potential reservoir of funds and recruits. At one point, the emperor even considered abandoning the capital and relocating to Carthage, only to be blocked by opinion in the city he ruled. Then came the final break, though its details remain obscured by limited evidence. Arab raids and conquest unfolded over decades, and the immediate aftermath is difficult to reconstruct with confidence. By the time Byzantine rule ended, much of the Maghreb seems to have been dominated by tribal groups, and the level of Roman culture in many regions was likely shallow or nearly absent. Even before the first major attacks, Latin civilization appears to have been retreating from much of the interior, surviving most strongly along the coastal fringes of Tunisia. Larger tribal groupings were forming and expanding, some Christian, some not, and the Byzantine administration itself was culturally foreign to the Latin-speaking population it tried to govern. When imperial forces arrived to resist, they were insufficient in the long run. Control could not be secure until Carthage was taken and sea reinforcement was cut off. Some of the fiercest resistance came not from old Roman cities, but from nomadic Libyan tribes around the Auris, groups whose way of life was directly threatened by any outside system that tried to fix borders and settle land. The early attacks caused enormous destruction in settled districts. At first, they were closer to large raiding expeditions than a complete takeover. But even raids can break an economy by burning stores, killing livestock, and frightening populations away from their fields. Scholars have debated how complete the collapse was. One view holds that town life and organised agriculture nearly vanished. Another suggests that a reduced version survived for centuries, and that later nomadic migrations delivered the final blow. Traces of Latin in Christian epitaphs survived in some areas, surprisingly late. Yet these fragments existed within a wider transformation that moved quickly. As groups converted to Islam, language and culture across much of the region shifted toward Arabic. The exact path of that change is still difficult to map in detail, but the overall direction is unmistakable. An older system, built over centuries, was replaced within a relatively short span. For long stretches, Roman Cyrenaica lived under a calmer sky than many other provinces. A small number of Italians settled early, and some families of Greek background gradually entered the Roman citizen body. Imperial authority occasionally intervened to set rules for daily coexistence, and the tone of those rules suggests an effort to keep relations between different legal groups predictable rather than punitive. Yet despite these administrative overlays, the province did not shed its older character. City life, education, public display, and cultural habits remained deeply Greek. Alongside the Greek majority stood a significant Jewish population, organised enough to sustain communal institutions in major towns such as Berenice and Cyrene. For decades, those communities kept their distance from upheavals elsewhere. They did not join the Great Revolt in Judea in the 1st century of Roman rule. But early in the 2nd century, a sudden explosion of violence erupted in Cyrene and then spread eastward into Egypt. The trigger is unclear, but the consequences were unmistakable. Heavy loss of life, widespread destruction, and a damaged urban landscape that required extraordinary measures to repair. The imperial government responded with reconstruction, and new settlers were brought in to help repopulate and stabilise the region. A period of relative order returned, though the province never fully escaped the larger insecurity that gradually seeped into the empire's edges. By the later 3rd century, trouble came from the desert-facing frontier. Groups living along the coast between Cyrenaica and Egypt began to raid and disrupt movement. When the empire was reorganized at the end of that century, Cyrenaica's administration was redrawn, and its military posture strengthened. The territory was split into 2 smaller units, with separate capitals, and for the first time a regular military command was established for the region. The change reflects a new reality. Security could no longer be assumed. By the late 4th century, a nomadic confederation that had previously troubled Tripolitania struck into Cyrenaica as well, and the province began to feel the same slow erosion of safety that afflicted many borderlands. One response appeared across the landscape in the 5th and 6th centuries, mirroring developments farther west: fortified farms. These were not grand frontier castles, but hardened agricultural installations, practical structures designed to protect families, stores, and water systems. They clustered especially in upland areas and in zones where raiders could descend quickly from open country. The pattern reveals a society trying to hold on to settled life by adapting its everyday infrastructure to violence. Religion followed its own routes across the region, and Cyrenaica's Christian story was shaped by its proximity to Egypt. The church seems to have expanded from the Nile world rather than from the Latin West. In the earlier centuries, a bishop in one of the main cities held senior standing over surrounding districts. But later the balance of ecclesiastical power shifted, and appointments increasingly reflected the influence of Alexandria. One of the most recognizable figures from Cyrenaica is Synesius, a wealthy citizen with philosophical interests who was pushed into the bishop's role partly because he could communicate with power in the imperial system and obtain practical help. In an age when provinces struggled to defend themselves and finance repairs, a leader who could write persuasively and negotiate effectively mattered as much as a theologian. Under Justinian, the imperial state invested again in defences across Africa, and Cyrenaica shared in that programme. Coastal towns and key sites received new works, and building also extended to churches. Excavations show expensive decorative campaigns that can seem surprising in a place often treated as marginal. The spending makes sense, however, if understood as political messaging. Beautified churches and strengthened walls were meant to announce that imperial order and religious orthodoxy still stood, even when the wider world looked unstable. On the eve of the Arab incursions into North Africa, Cyrenaica likely resembled many eastern provinces, battered, more militarized than before, still functioning, but increasingly exposed to pressures from the desert and from the weakening reach of central authority. Soon after Egypt fell, raids pushed westward into the lands beyond the Nile frontier. The newcomers described the region as the Western Lands, and in time it was drawn into a larger Islamic empire governed from a distant capital. Earlier conquerors had left traces, but this conquest proved more enduring in language and culture than any before it. Over the centuries that followed, much of the indigenous population adopted Islam, and in many areas Arabic speech and identity spread as well. The Christian communities that had once been deeply rooted across the Maghreb gradually disappeared. This transformation did not rely mainly on mass-forced conversion or a single organised campaign to teach doctrine. Instead, a slower and more complex process unfolded. Islam became, for many local groups, a language of legitimacy and protest. It offered a framework through which resistance to distant rulers could be justified, and through which rival leadership could be supported. Among peoples with strong traditions of independence, the new faith gained appeal as much through politics and social realignments as through persuasion from above. The earliest Western raids focused heavily on Cyrenaica, which was close to Egypt and accessible by routes already known to armies. Tunisia was struck repeatedly soon afterward, but for a time the raids did not become full occupation. Internal conflicts among Muslim leaders delayed sustained expansion, especially during the crisis that followed the murder of a caliph in the mid-7th century. Only after a new dynasty consolidated power and began to view North Africa through the lens of its rivalry with the Byzantine Empire did a systematic conquest take shape. A commander moved into Tunisia, established control, and founded a new inland base that became the first durable centre of Arab administration in the region. From there, the conquest pushed westward into lands where semi-settled Berber communities had already developed forms of leadership larger than small clans. Negotiation and conversion sometimes went together. A prominent Berber leader accepted Islam, and for a moment it created a workable basis for coexistence because recognizing the faith also implied recognizing the authority claimed by the conquerors. But that balance depended on restraint. When command changed and direct control was demanded over the whole region, coexistence collapsed into open war. A dramatic campaign followed. Arab forces crossed through Algeria and northern Morocco, reached the Atlantic, and pressed southward into river valleys in the far southwest. The retreat turned fatal. Near the desert edge, a coalition of Berber forces, aided by Byzantine elements, struck the returning army and killed its commander. His death, and the sheer scale of his march, made him a lasting hero in later memory, a symbol of conquest at the edge of the known world. Yet the immediate outcome was not a clean victory for either side. The conquerors had advanced too far to accept defeat. but the resistance proved strong enough to force reinforcements and repeated campaigns. One army reoccupied the Tunisian base and pursued the Berber leader westward. Fighting ended with his death, but the commander who achieved it was soon killed in a counterattack farther east. Another large force arrived later and faced fierce opposition in the eastern mountains, led by a woman remembered in Arabic tradition as a prophetic or priestly figure. Her defeat marked a turning point. Afterward, the conquerors captured the main Byzantine administrative centre in Tunisia and began building a new coastal town nearby. Naval dominance sealed the result, forcing the Byzantines to abandon their remaining positions along the coast. Soon, the eastern Maghreb was organized as a distinct province within the Muslim Empire, separated administratively from Egypt. As rule solidified, a contradiction moved to the forefront. Arab leaders governed in the name of a religion that proclaimed equality among believers, but they also emphasized ethnic privilege and exercised power in ways that often ignored religious ideals. This tension became sharper as Berbers entered Islam in large numbers, often through military service. Berber contingents joined major campaigns, including the invasion of Iberia, yet they were treated as clients of Arab tribes, paid less, and denied equal standing. The spoils of conquest flowed mainly to an Arab elite. Grievances spread beyond soldiers into wider society, intensified by exploitative practices such as the taking of human tribute from tribes, which supplied slaves to ruling households. One caliph attempted reforms, condemning such tribute and sending teachers to instruct Berbers in the faith. But the effort was brief and did not outlast his reign. In an unintended way, the contrast between the ideals of Islam and the behavior of rulers strengthened a growing conviction across the Maghreb that the faith itself could not be equated with the dynasty that claimed to represent it. Into that atmosphere stepped a revolutionary religious movement that offered both doctrine and political permission to resist. Its teachings rejected the idea that leadership belonged by birth or ethnicity to any one people, and insisted that piety and learning were the true qualifications for rule. It also legitimized rebellion against unjust authority. These ideas resonated strongly among Berber groups who had accepted Islam but refused to accept permanent subordination. A major rebellion erupted in the far northwest, quickly growing into a shockwave that shattered Arab control across wide stretches of the Maghreb. In a few years, rebels had seized most of Algeria and threatened the main administrative centre in Tunisia. Meanwhile, a more moderate branch of the same movement gained dominance in Tripolitania by converting local tribes, a process driven by propagandists arriving from distant eastern centres. The result was not a single unified revolution, but multiple regions moving under related banners, each shaped by local alliances and rivalries. As the wider Muslim world entered its own dynastic crisis, local power in North Africa shifted again. A family linked to the early conquest seized control in Tunisia, taking advantage of turmoil in the east. Their authority was never complete, because southern districts were dominated by militant Berber groups aligned with the more extreme revolutionary faction. Soon those tribes pushed north and captured the administrative centre itself, but their victory did not last. Leaders of the moderate faction proclaimed their own religious ruler and took Tunisia, creating a state that joined Tripolitania and Tunisia under a new ideological framework. That state endured only until a newly consolidated caliphal government in the east sent an army to restore direct rule. Even then, control remained limited. Eastern authorities could impose their power mainly on Tunisia, parts of eastern Algeria, and Tripolitania. Governors relied on a restless Arab army whose loyalties were often unstable. When those troops mutinied, the province effectively became a semi-independent kingdom, ruled by a local dynasty that acknowledged the caliph in name and paid tribute to secure recognition. This arrangement suited both sides. Local rulers gained freedom of action, while the distant caliphate received money and the appearance of unity. North Africa in the early medieval period did not move in a single straight line from conquest to stability. It fractured, regrouped, and reinvented itself through new alliances, religious movements, and the hard logic of trade routes and tribal power. In the decades after direct rule from the Eastern Caliphate tightened, the region produced several competing centres of authority, some born from migration, others from local ambitions, and others from religious networks that stretched far beyond the desert. A major turning point came when the new rulers in the east reasserted control over the central Maghreb. The collapse of an earlier Ibadi-led regime in Tunisia and Tripolitania did not end the Ibadi movement. Instead, pressure and military defeat triggered migration. Important Ibadi communities, especially from Tripolitania and the southern Tunisian frontier zones, moved westward into Algeria. There, the movement gained an organizer with unusual credentials, a leader of Persian origin who had grown up in Tunisia and had already held high responsibility during the short-lived Ibadi administration. In Algeria, he emerged as a rallying figure, coordinating attacks against the caliphal presence and turning scattered groups into a more coherent force. From this shift came a new political centre in the interior. A capital began to rise in the Algerian highlands, positioned where key Ibadi tribes were concentrated and where caravan routes could be monitored rather than merely visited. This city was not designed as a coastal showpiece. It was built to endure, to negotiate, and to connect. The leadership that formed there adopted the language of religious legitimacy, presenting itself as an imamat, a community guided by an imam who held both spiritual authority and political command. Over time, that office became tied to one family, a development that clashed with the movement's own ideals about leadership. A split followed within Ibadi circles. Because hereditary succession looked too much like the dynastic politics the movement had criticized elsewhere, yet the fracture did not immediately weaken the state's position. For many tribes across western Algeria, southern Tunisia, and Tripolitania, this imamate still represented a credible alternative to distant caliphal authority. The new rulers did not maintain control by mass force alone. Their influence travelled through people and routine contact. Tribal leaders were encouraged to visit the capital, to be seen, to consult, and to return home with recognition and gifts. Envoys circulated through allied territories, renewing loyalties, settling disputes, and ensuring that tribute and cooperation did not collapse into rivalry. Among the most valued partners were the Nafusa communities of Tripolitania, long associated with Ibadi teaching and unusually reliable as supporters. They were entrusted with significant offices which strengthened the bond between the highland capital and the desert-facing west. This was not simply piety in action, it was statecraft. The capital itself became known for prosperity and diversity. Its importance came from geography and function. It sat where caravan traffic could meet, exchange, and rest. Merchants arriving from the north and the interior found a place where trade was protected, rather than preyed upon. Over time, the city developed a cosmopolitan character, shaped by traders, scholars, tribal delegations, and visitors moving between the Maghreb and the Sahara. Its rulers generally preferred coexistence with neighbours over constant expansion. That policy frustrated hardline supporters among more militant Ibadi groups, especially in Tripolitania and southern Tunisia, who wanted confrontation rather than diplomacy. But restraint had advantages. It kept the state alive for generations, until a new power, driven by a different religious vision and a more aggressive political program, finally destroyed the capital at the start of the 10th century. While the Algerian interior produced an Ibadi-centered state, the far southwestern routes produced something else. A trading principality, anchored to an oasis world. After the great Berber rebellions of the 8th century, groups linked to an extremist current of Kharijite belief moved from northern Morocco toward the southern oases. They settled in Tafilalt, a zone already known for its role in Saharan exchange. A new town rose there in the later 8th century and quickly became a pivot point between north and south. Its rulers built authority less through conquest than through control of commerce. Who could pass, where caravans could resupply, and which markets could be supplied with gold, salt, slaves, and goods that travelled enormous distances. At its height, this oasis principality extended influence along the drier region. But even at its peak, it remained primarily a commercial power. It did not dominate the politics of the whole Maghreb. Its strength was in trade networks and in the security it could offer to merchants who feared robbery, betrayal, or hostile rivals. In this world, survival depended on managing relationships with desert tribes, caravan leaders, and northern cities that needed what the Sahara delivered. Farther north, in Morocco, a different kind of legitimacy became decisive. Descent from the Prophet's family. A powerful tribal confederation sought to consolidate its rule by adopting a more formal Islamic character, and it invited a sharif to settle among them. The move offered two advantages at once. It tied local authority to sacred lineage, and it strengthened the claim that rule in Morocco did not need to be granted by a caliph far away. The first leader associated with this project gained recognition but was assassinated, a reminder that symbolic legitimacy could still provoke fear in distant capitals. Yet, the project survived him. His son, elevated while still young, became the figure around whom a new state formed. This Moroccan state gathered momentum as waves of Arab refugees arrived, from both Iberia and the central Maghreb. Those newcomers reshaped the social character of the new polity. The capital moved to a city being built, with clear ambition, a place designed not merely as a tribal seat, but as an urban centre that could host scholars, merchants, artisans, and migrants. Over time, the state became more distinctly Arab in culture, even while it continued to present itself as aligned with Berber rejection of distant caliphal rule. In doctrine, it leaned Sunni, but politically it used sacred descent as a cornerstone of legitimacy. For decades it extended across much of present-day Morocco, yet this unity did not last. From the later 9th century onward, tribal coalitions shifted, and alliances formed with the Umayyad power in Iberia, weakening the Moroccan rulers' reach beyond their main cities. Even so, their urban project mattered. Under their rule, Islamic urban culture took deeper root in Morocco, and Fez emerged as a long-lasting centre of religious and cultural authority. In Tunisia, meanwhile, another dynasty faced a different problem. Governing a region where old Arab land-holding families held power, while diverse urban communities and heavily taxed rural populations grew resentful. The ruling house that emerged there learned to survive through balancing acts. It had to manage Arab troops that could rebel, and it had to answer growing pressure from religious scholars who framed grievances in moral terms. By this time, Sunni legal schools had become established, and debates about law and justice were no longer abstract. They shaped demands about taxation, public order, and the conduct of rulers. Scholars associated with stricter legal approaches gained popularity as defenders of ordinary people against corruption and heavy burdens. To ease tensions, the rulers adopted religious public works and gave scholars offices such as judgeships, making them part of the system rather than permanent opponents. Major mosques and sacred building programs helped project piety and legitimacy. At the same time, foreign expansion offered another outlet. A long campaign across the sea, framed with religious meaning, helped redirect the energies of troops who might otherwise turn against their own rulers. Conquest abroad could absorb unrest at home, at least for a time. Yet the most dramatic transformation came from a movement that combined preaching, organization, and military discipline. An extremist Shiite mission worked methodically to build opposition against existing rule. A skilled propagandist entered the mountainous villages of eastern Algeria and focused on a sedentary Berber people living in small communities. They were devout, socially tight-knit, and vulnerable to harassment from garrison posts manned by Arab troops. Over time, patient instruction and structured leadership turned grievance into a disciplined force. The result was not a chaotic uprising, but a trained movement able to defeat professional soldiers, expand territory, and ultimately overthrow the Tunisian dynasty. A fortified residence near Cairo fell, and soon the leader of the wider mission arrived to claim authority. The new state that emerged aimed to remake the region under Shiite leadership, with its ruler presenting himself not simply as a king, but as the rightful imam of the Muslim community. A fortified coastal capital was built to secure the regime and to guard against sudden counterattacks. From there, efforts began to push westward, but the western Maghreb proved difficult terrain for lasting control. Powerful Berber confederations resisted, and the Umayyads of Iberia exploited that resistance, occupying key coastal enclaves and using them as bases for influence and coordination. In the east, however, the new regime had loyal Berber allies, and its core holdings largely matched the older province it had inherited. Inside Tunisia, the shift in doctrine and taxation produced new tensions. Some old Arab elites adapted, converting in ways that preserved privileges. Many Maliki scholars, however, opposed the new Shiite state. Differences in ritual and law mattered, but so did the fiscal pressure of maintaining a large army. Repression followed, and in moments of desperation, even rival sects found temporary common cause against the regime. Eventually, the centre of gravity moved again when the Shiite rulers conquered Egypt and relocated their main power to Cairo. North Africa was then governed through viceroys, and over time, those viceroys became less dependent on their patrons. A Berber dynasty took the reins in Tunisia on behalf of the Cairo-based rulers, but cultural gravity pulled them toward the dominant Arab Islamic norms of the region. Maliki law regained strength, scholarly authority grew, and sectarian tensions erupted into violence. By the early 11th century, anti-Shiite riots broke out, with catastrophic loss of life and mass looting. In the following decades, the Tunisian rulers formally renounced allegiance to Cairo, and this decision triggered one of the most consequential demographic shocks in Maghrebi history. For a long time, the Maghreb looked like a mosaic of competing powers. After the first wave of Arab rule and then the fading reach of distant dynasties, local politics often broke into small states, shifting coalitions, and rival religious currents. That long phase of fragmentation did not last forever. Two Berber-led empires would eventually pull the region back into larger units, first through the rise of the Almoravids, and then through the even more sweeping conquests of the Almohads. The Almoravid story begins far to the south and west, in a world shaped by tribal confederations and desert commerce. A reform movement took shape among the Sanhaja tribes in the mid-11th century. Religious discipline was not only about belief, it also became a tool for tightening unity at a moment of danger. Trade routes that had enriched certain tribes were under growing pressure from rivals on both sides, and the desert's balance of power was shifting. Into this tension stepped a stern teacher and organizer, a scholar trained in the religious learning that had spread across the Maghrib in earlier centuries. His message demanded rigorous obedience to established legal norms and a hard line against practices seen as corrupting the faith. The movement gained a reputation for discipline and for living like a fighting brotherhood, trained for both religious correction and war. That identity mattered because it allowed scattered tribal forces to act as a single machine. Once the new coalition secured key nodes in the caravan economy, it moved north. Control of the oasis gateways opened a path into Morocco itself. Resistance was not absent, and the movement's founder died in a violent clash on the Atlantic side of the country. Leadership then shifted to a major tribal commander, a man who briefly returned south to put down rebellion in his own base. In his absence, command in Morocco passed to a relative, who would become the central architect of the empire's expansion. Under this new commander, the Almoravids surged across much of the Maghrib and then crossed into Al-Andalus. Iberia at this time was politically divided, and its small Muslim states struggled to withstand the momentum of Christian advances. Appeals for help opened the door to intervention. The Almoravid army arrived as a disciplined force from across the straits and soon became more than a temporary ally. Over the following years, the Almoravids absorbed the Iberian principalities into their own system. Meanwhile, their North African reach stretched eastward to the central coast of Algeria. A new capital city was founded inland, built to serve as an administrative heart rather than a mere military camp. Marrakesh grew into the centre of a vast realm linking desert routes, Moroccan cities, and Iberian courts. Inside this empire, power rested on a tribal ruling class drawn from the Desert Confederation that had launched the movement. Their identity was visible, even in clothing, and it marked a distinction between the rulers and much of the population they governed. The leading tribe within this ruling group filled the most important posts in the army and administration. Religious jurists played an unusually strong role, supervising judges, advising governors, and shaping policy through a strict legal mindset. This created stability and order, but it also produced rigidity. New religious trends and mystical currents circulating from Iberia and the wider Islamic world were treated as threats. The state backed the jurists in suppressing teachings that might weaken their authority or loosen the grip of legal discipline. That pressure helped generate the next revolution. Opposition formed against an Islam that seemed, to many, reduced to narrow legal formulas. A new movement emerged in the Atlas Mountains, fueled by the language of pure monotheism and by attacks on interpretations that appeared to give the divine human-like traits. Its founder came from a Berber mountain people and had travelled widely, returning with a message that challenged the religious order of the Almoravid state. He preached publicly, denouncing the idea that Islam should be confined to the authority of a single legal tradition, and he called for a return to scripture and prophetic example as the ultimate standard. The Almoravid authorities could not tolerate this challenge. The preacher fled Marrakesh and withdrew into the High Atlas, where he built a disciplined community among his own tribal world. This was not only a circle of students, it became a movement with structure, loyalty, and a powerful claim. Many followers treated him as the expected redeemer who would restore true guidance. From a mountain base, the movement trained itself for a long struggle. When the founder died, leadership passed to his most capable lieutenant, a man from the region around Tlemcen, who would turn religious rebellion into an empire. This successor first secured control of the mountain zones, building a foundation of manpower and safe territory. Then the campaign widened. northern Morocco, western Algeria, and finally the Almoravid heartlands. Major cities fell in sequence, including Fez and then Marrakesh, ending Almoravid rule in Morocco. Iberia followed as the new empire extended across the straits and took control of Muslim Spain. The expansion did not stop there. In the east, North Africa's coastline had become vulnerable to outside powers, including forces based in Sicily that had seized positions along the Tunisian shore during a period of local weakness. The Almohads pushed into the eastern Maghrib, taking cities and driving their rivals back. For a rare moment, nearly the entire Maghrib came under one indigenous authority, stretching from the Atlantic facing west to Tripolitania in the east. Like the Almoravids, the Almohads were a Berber-led state built on tribal power. Their ruling base came from the mountain tribes that had formed the movement's first core. Yet their religious identity was less straightforward in practice than in revolutionary slogans. They rejected the idea that one legal school should define Islam, but judges and administrators often relied on familiar legal traditions simply to keep society functioning. Over time, popular religious life also shifted. Belief in the founder's special role faded as mystical spirituality and devotion to holy men grew stronger among ordinary people. At court, the atmosphere was different. Learning, philosophy, and the sciences were cultivated. An elite culture became a stage for scholarship that reached beyond strictly legal debates. This diversity carried a cost. A movement built on unity of belief and purpose began to strain under its own contradictions. Tension sharpened when the ruling leader designated his own son as heir, turning leadership into a dynasty even though the ruling tribal coalition expected power to circulate among its chiefs. Opposition was crushed through force and political restructuring. A prominent family from the original mountain coalition was elevated to second rank, gaining major authority beneath the ruling house. The arrangement reduced immediate conflict but did not remove the underlying friction, because the dynasty still had to manage rival expectations inside its own base. The empire's cohesion weakened further when it faced renewed crisis in the east. A rival lineage, linked to the old Almoravid order and still powerful from island bases, launched a comeback into North Africa. With support from local Arab tribes, they disrupted Almohad authority in eastern Algeria and then Tunisia. A major Almohad ruler responded with repeated campaigns, restoring control and then appointing a governor from the high-ranking family that had been placed just below the dynasty. That governor's house gained leverage in Tunisia, crushed the remaining resistance, and gradually became the effective master of the region. When the Almohad leadership later abandoned the movement's original doctrine, the eastern rulers used the moment to declare independence. In the west, the Almohads were also losing the ability to contain nomadic, tribal movements from the south. Groups of Zenata tribes pushed northward with their herds, pressing into richer lands and exploiting political weakness. One branch advanced across Algeria into Morocco, captured Fez, and became the new power of the northern country. Soon the old Almohad capital itself fell, ending the empire's rule. In western Algeria, another Zenata group established its own state around Tlemcen. It was repeatedly attacked by the Moroccan dynasty to the west, yet it endured through skillful survival and regional diplomacy, maintaining authority for centuries. After the Almohad era ended, the Western Islamic world of North Africa did not remain under one banner. Power settled into three main dynasties, each rooted in Amazigh society, and each centered on a different political heart. In the east, a ruling house based in Tunis controlled much of what is now Tunisia and extended influence into eastern Algeria and the Libyan coastlands. In the far west, a Moroccan dynasty ruled from the cities of the Atlantic and inland plains. Between them, a third state formed around Tlemcen, holding western Algeria whenever it was not pressed by stronger neighbours. What followed was not simply a change of rulers, it was a change in how authority justified itself. Earlier empires had tried to anchor legitimacy in rigid religious frameworks, either by enforcing strict legal orthodoxy or by promoting a sweeping reformist ideology. Over time, both approaches proved too brittle to carry stable government across a vast region of cities, mountains, deserts, and tribal confederations. The rulers who came after learned a different lesson. Instead of binding the state to a single doctrine, they allowed religious life to breathe in many directions. Political legitimacy was built less on claiming religious perfection and more on cultivating cooperation with respected scholars, judges, and community leaders. This shift transformed the great cities. Capitals became magnets for learning, not only because rulers wanted prestige, but because scholarship helped hold society together. Major mosques were expanded and refined. Schools and residential colleges appeared, funded by the state, creating a pipeline of trained jurists and administrators. The dominant legal tradition returned to the centre of public life, respected and supported, yet kept at arm's length from direct control of government. Scholars gained honours and privileges, but the day-to-day steering of policy remained in the hands of princes, courts, and military households. Alongside the world of judges and classrooms, another current had been spreading for centuries: Sufism. By this period, holy men, lodge networks, and devotional lineages reached into both crowded cities and remote countryside. In urban settings, their influence often competed with the authority of jurists and officials. In rural districts, their presence could be decisive. Many communities treated local saints as guardians of moral order, arbiters of disputes, and anchors of social stability. This was not simply because of spiritual charisma. It was also because the practical reach of government often stopped at the walls of the capital and a chain of garrison towns. Farther out, tribal society ran on its own rhythms. Court politics usually ignored that world unless it erupted into crisis, such as a succession struggle inside the ruling family or a major war that demanded tribal manpower. External pressure pushed these states into difficult choices. From the middle of the 13th century, Christian kingdoms in Iberia intensified the squeeze across the sea. The Eastern dynasty sometimes claimed a spiritual inheritance from the earlier empire, but such claims gradually softened into diplomatic reality. Rather than launching major campaigns westward or sending decisive aid into Spain, Eastern rulers prioritized survival, trade, and internal balance. In Morocco, the Western dynasty inherited the old front line. Its rulers carried the burden of facing Iberian expansion, yet their own politics rarely allowed sustained initiative. Their strategy became defensive and pragmatic. Hold footholds in southern Spain when possible, protect the Moroccan coast, and help the Muslim state of Granada remain standing as a buffer between North Africa and the advancing Christian powers. A turning point came when the last major western bridgehead across the straits fell to a large Christian coalition. That defeat echoed across the Maghreb not only as a military loss, but as a shock to prestige. At the same time, the eastern and central states were building commercial ties with Christian Aragon. In exchange for trading access, they hired experienced foreign soldiers, especially from the Catalan world, to reinforce their armies. This contrast mattered. It meant that, while one Maghribi dynasty was bleeding in a frontier struggle, the others were balancing commerce and security through deals and mercenaries. The imbalance helped provoke invasion. A Moroccan sultan, ambitious and confident, marched east. His armies swept through the central lands and continued into Tunisia, reaching as far as the eastern coastlands. For a moment, the old dream of reuniting the Maghrib seemed possible. It did not last. Arab tribal forces in Tunisia rallied against the invaders. Resistance spread through countryside routes that the occupiers could not easily police. The Moroccan army was overwhelmed, and the Sultan escaped by sea. A second invasion followed under his successor, but it met the same hard limit: tribal opposition that could not be crushed without a stable base of supply and legitimacy. The Moroccan armies withdrew, and the eastern political map reasserted itself. From the mid-14th century into the end of the 15th, the region's politics were shaped less by grand conquest than by internal fractures. Dynasties fought among themselves, and rival branches battled for thrones. In the east, the problem was sharpened by the strength of tribal blocs that controlled large districts. At times, the eastern realm split into competing centres, each backed by a different tribal coalition. Reunification came, but stability arrived in cycles rather than as a permanent condition. Even so, urban intellectual life did not collapse. Courts and cities continued to sponsor learning, and the region produced one of its most influential thinkers, a historian who watched political rise and decay with a sharp eye and tried to explain power not as fate, but as a pattern grounded in social cohesion. In central Algeria, dynastic quarrels opened doors for Moroccan influence. Tlemcen sometimes fell under outside pressure and sometimes regained autonomy. Yet Moroccan rulers, caught in turmoil at home, repeatedly failed to turn temporary dominance into lasting unification. By the end of the medieval period, the Maghrib remained a patchwork of states, connected by trade and scholarship but divided by dynastic rivalry and the stubborn geography of mountains and deserts. Then, around the turn of the 16th century, the line of conflict moved. The frontier that had once cut across Iberia shifted onto North African shores. Portuguese forces seized coastal positions in Morocco, while Spain, after ending Muslim rule in Granada, began building garrisons along the Maghribi coast. Strong points appeared at key harbours and strategic promontories, including major sites in Algeria and Libya. In North Africa, the threat was now immediate and visible. Foreign cannon, coastal forts, and ships that could strike where local armies could not easily respond. In Morocco, the shock produced a religious and political reaction. A Sharifian house in the south, claiming prophetic descent, organised tribes into a militant movement. Sufi leaders helped mobilise support, turning resistance into a broad coalition. The movement fought not only the Portuguese but also Morocco's own ruling dynasty, which had tolerated coexistence with European occupiers. Step by step, the rebels seized major inland cities, captured coastal strongholds, and forced the Portuguese out of their remaining positions. They then took the northern capital and reunited the country under a new monarchy. The regime built its strength on a blend of religious prestige, alliances with settled agricultural and merchant communities, and the growing importance of firearms. At its height, Morocco fielded a professional army, supported by foreign specialists and mercenaries. With this force, the Sultan imposed order across the realm, held off pressure from the east, and projected power beyond the desert. A dramatic expedition shattered a major West African empire and brought immense wealth and captives back north. Yet this peak was followed by fragmentation after the ruler's death, as heirs and rivals carved the country into competing principalities. Out of that disorder, another Sharifian dynasty eventually rose and established long-term rule. It consolidated power by mobilizing Arab tribal allies and by defeating a powerful Berber principality in the interior. Its greatest builder created a hard-edged state anchored in a professional army recruited from enslaved soldiers. Many descended from earlier waves brought north from sub-Saharan campaigns. The system produced unity, but it also created new dangers. After this ruler died, succession disputes erupted among a vast number of claimants, and military officers became kingmakers. Decades of instability followed, marked by economic decline and recurring disorder. Recovery came later under more pragmatic rulers who stabilized the country, expanded trade, and tried to manage tensions with tribes that followed strong Sufi leaders. Even as Morocco regained footing, the 19th century introduced new pressure. European economic penetration and, eventually, the French conquest next door. Challenges that traditional institutions struggled to meet. Farther east, a different kind of power took shape. The Ottoman Empire, after taking Egypt, entered the Maghreb's coastal struggle through naval war and corsair politics. Seafaring commanders turned Algiers into a base against Spanish positions. After one of these leaders fell in battle, his successor sought Ottoman support, trading formal allegiance for military backing. With that support, Ottoman influence expanded across much of North Africa. In Algeria, Ottoman rule evolved into a distinctive regime. Governors sent from the imperial capital were gradually eclipsed by the troops stationed on the ground. Soldiers rebelled, installed one of their own officers as ruler, and created a military republic in practice. The new leadership maintained religious ties to the Ottoman Sultan and adopted the legal tradition favoured by the empire, but it operated with wide autonomy. Revenue flowed from maritime raiding, ransom, and protection payments extracted from European states. Local communities often tolerated the regime because taxation could be lighter than feared, and because local leaders retained autonomy over daily affairs. In the countryside, rulers sought the goodwill of Sufi networks that could calm tribal regions and secure routes. Over time, the Mediterranean balance tilted. European naval power grew stronger and the profits of corsair warfare declined. To compensate, rulers raised taxes, triggering conflicts with tribal districts and undermining stability. By the time France invaded, the regime's foundation had been weakened by these internal strains as much as by outside pressure. In Tunisia, Ottoman influence followed a comparable path but produced a different outcome. Ottoman forces seized Tunis, lost it briefly to Spanish intervention, and returned later to establish control. Soldiers again pushed aside distant governors, but the system evolved. A countryside commander, responsible for taxation and order, became the real power and eventually founded a local dynasty that ruled in the Ottoman shadow, but largely on its own terms. This monarchy recognized the Ottoman Sultan's religious prestige while governing independently. It adopted the official Ottoman legal tradition in name, yet relied heavily on local notables and the dominant local scholars to manage law and religion. Piracy remained important, but the state also profited from trade monopolies, controlling key goods and selling them through intermediaries who could operate within Mediterranean markets. In Libya, Ottoman rule began with the capture of Tripoli from a military order and expanded over a wide territory. Later, a cavalry commander seized power and founded his own dynasty, again under Ottoman symbolism, but with local autonomy. Libya's geography tied it strongly to trans-Saharan commerce, and coastal raiding brought additional wealth. International rivalries, especially between Britain and France, increasingly shaped trade and diplomacy. When internal rebellion and foreign pressure mounted, the Ottoman centre returned to impose direct control again, signalling that local dynasties could rise and fall quickly when the wider balance shifted. By the early 19th century, North Africa stood at a crossroads. The region was not a single political unit, but a patchwork of authorities shaped by centuries of dynastic rule, Ottoman influence, and local autonomy. Morocco remained a sovereign kingdom under its own dynasty. To the east, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya functioned as self-governing states that still acknowledged the spiritual prestige of the Ottoman Sultan. That balance would not survive the accelerating ambitions of European powers. The turning point came in 1830 when a French expedition seized Algiers. The occupation did more than topple a local regime. It announced that the Mediterranean had entered a new phase, one in which European armies and markets would increasingly dictate the rules. Almost immediately, the shockwaves spread. Tunisia and Morocco faced mounting pressure, while Libya's fate became entangled in Ottoman decisions and European rivalries. In the same decade, the Ottoman government reasserted direct control in Tripoli, tightening its hold over Libya in 1835. These events disrupted a wider attempt among North African rulers to strengthen their states, using European-style institutions, armies, and administration, similar to earlier modernization efforts seen in Egypt. As the 19th century unfolded, only Tunisia and Morocco managed to remain independent long enough to face a second, harsher wave of European demands. The new pressure did not always arrive as soldiers at the gate. It often arrived through treaties, trade privileges, and legal reforms presented as necessities for free commerce and foreign security. Tunisia answered with ambitious internal changes. In the middle decades of the century, reforms promised equality before the law for Muslim, Christian, and Jewish subjects, and attempted to create a more orderly system of justice. A constitution briefly introduced consultative government and legal modernization, only to be suspended when political strain and resistance grew. Yet the reformist project did not disappear. It returned through financial control as foreign debt brought international supervision. A talented statesman later used that framework to strengthen administration from within. By the late 1870s, Tunisia could be described as more coherent internally than many expected. But it was vulnerable externally, exposed to the leverage that creditors and European diplomacy could apply. Morocco's situation was different and in some ways more difficult. European powers pushed for trade concessions, while large tribal regions resisted the steady reach of central authority. Morocco suffered military defeats against France and Spain, and yet it remained formally independent for decades because it could lean on British support in its dealings with Europe. That support came at a cost. Europeans living in Moroccan cities often operated beyond local control under consular protection, creating zones of impunity that weakened sovereignty from within. Even so, Moroccan rulers worked gradually to extend state authority by installing district governors and building networks of control that reached toward the south. By the start of the 20th century, Morocco stood almost alone in North Africa as an independent state, a status made more precarious after Tunisia fell under French control. Libya, meanwhile, drifted into relative obscurity after the Ottoman reoccupation of Tripoli. Administered as a distant province, it drew less attention until the age of formal colonization arrived. Algeria, by contrast, became the central arena of French expansion. The conquest was not swift. It was violent, protracted, and expensive. French forces spent years expanding beyond coastal control, fighting local resistance and gradually absorbing territory. Decades passed before military rule was replaced by a civilian system. When Algeria was incorporated into France itself, it became a prize for European settlers. But that triumph came at a steep price for the native Muslim population, which was denied equal political rights and faced repressive administration and economic displacement. European immigration altered the demographic balance. Settlers from France, Italy, and Spain concentrated in the cities, where some major urban centres developed European majorities. The colonial economy was reoriented toward export production, especially crops that served metropolitan markets. Wealth and land accumulated unevenly, and rural communities experienced growing impoverishment. Critics in France condemned these injustices, and French officials later tried, with mixed success, to avoid repeating the same pattern when they extended control into Tunisia and Morocco. A protectorate system offered a different model of domination. Tunisia became a French protectorate in the early 1880s after diplomatic conditions shifted in Europe and objections to French expansion faded. French authorities kept the local ruling administration in place, but it operated under supervision, making sovereignty more appearance than reality. Morocco followed a similar path later. Diplomatic deals among European powers cleared the way for France to impose a protectorate in 1912, while Spain took control of northern and southern zones. Control of the interior proceeded through a strategy that combined negotiation, administrative expansion, and selective force, though resistance in the mountainous north erupted into a major war in the 1920s and delayed full pacification for years. Italy entered the colonial contest through Libya. In 1911, it invaded and tried to build a new empire across the Libyan coast and desert. Control, however, was contested for decades. A religious and political movement based in Cyrenaica sustained prolonged resistance. Only in the early 1930s did the Italian state finally crush organized opposition, executing a celebrated guerrilla leader whose name became a symbol of defiance. By the eve of the Second World War, settler colonization in Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya was well advanced, and the colonial order seemed entrenched. The war changed the equation. North Africa became a strategic theatre, and the old colonial system could no longer present itself as permanent. Nationalist movements gained momentum, fueled by long frustration and by the new language of self-determination spreading across the world. In Libya, a leader linked to the Cyrenaican resistance returned from wartime exile with British backing and emerged as the monarch of an independent state in 1951. Tunisia's nationalism matured through political parties that demanded constitutional government and sovereignty. In Morocco, nationalism consolidated into a powerful independence movement that mobilized urban elites and wider society. Algeria's path was more explosive. Early reformers who had hoped for full inclusion within France were blocked, and their failure opened space for more radical currents, including movements centered on separatism and on Arab Islamic reform. After the war, France conceded independence to Tunisia and Morocco in 1956, calculating that it could focus its remaining strength on Algeria. That strategy collapsed into a full-scale Algerian revolution, beginning in 1954, a brutal conflict that ended with independence in 1962 and a mass departure of much of the European settler population. Independence did not bring a single outcome across the region. Oil transformed Libya and later shaped Algeria's economy as well. Libya's monarchy fell to a military coup in 1969, replacing royal authority with a new revolutionary regime built around charismatic rule and claims of popular sovereignty. In Algeria, petroleum and natural gas became the foundation of state planning and industrial ambition, while agriculture was neglected. Disappointment and social strain later contributed to political upheaval and the weakening of one-party dominance. Tunisia followed another path. A long-lived presidency anchored in secular nationalism and a pro-Western stance, later replaced by a new authoritarian order. Tourism became a pillar of the economy, bringing revenue but also vulnerability. Morocco, lacking large oil reserves, relied more on agriculture and phosphates, while pursuing territorial claims that drew it into prolonged conflict in the Western Sahara. To understand why Algeria became the crucible of French colonial ambition, it helps to look back before 1830. Algeria's geography made centralized rule difficult. Mountain chains limited easy movement between the fertile north and the desert interior. Good harbours existed, but they did not automatically open the hinterland to outside control. Regional ties often pulled in different directions, with western areas historically leaning toward Morocco and eastern areas toward Tunisia. Cultural diversity further complicated unification, as significant communities spoke Tamazight languages and maintained distinct identities. In that setting, Ottoman-era Algeria functioned less like a nation-state in formation and more like a coastal-centered political space, balanced between local power, trade, and negotiated authority. The immediate spark for war with France is often associated with a public confrontation between the ruler of Algiers and the French consul in the late 1820s, set against a background of financial disputes and unpaid debts. Yet the deeper motive lay elsewhere. France saw strategic advantage and domestic political opportunity in a foreign expedition. An invasion force landed near Algiers in 1830. The local regime collapsed quickly, and its ruler accepted exile. What followed exposed the character of the conquest. Promises made during surrender were violated. Property was seized. Religious and private buildings were taken over. Looting and dispossession spread around the capital. The conquest began not as a slow administrative takeover, but as a shock campaign that tore at the social and economic foundations of local life. Events in France then added instability. A revolution at home overthrew the monarchy just days after Algiers fell. Some French voices had dismissed the expedition as cynical distraction, but withdrawal was politically unattractive once occupation had begun. Paris debated alternatives, including indirect rule through local proxies. Proposals were floated to install outside princes under French patronage, but mistrust and diplomatic confusion undermined these schemes. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground grew more costly. Command changed hands repeatedly. French forces secured parts of the coastal plain and pushed into nearby towns. Cities were bombarded. Ports were occupied. Yet beyond these zones, resistance hardened. In the west, a leader emerged who could unite fighting forces and give resistance both moral and political direction. Drawing support from religious networks and tribal alliances, he became the most formidable opponent of French expansion. French authorities attempted negotiation and signed agreements that recognized his authority over wide areas, but miscommunication and duplicity poisoned the arrangements. French columns moved through contested territory. The resistance replied with renewed war. For a time, French control shrank back toward the coast. France then escalated. The conquest became an all-out campaign requiring massive troop commitments. The methods were harsh. Villages were destroyed, harvests and livestock were targeted, and civilian suffering was widespread. The resistance relied on mobility and hit-and-run tactics, but the imbalance of resources and relentless pressure narrowed its options. After years of warfare, the leader surrendered in the late 1840s. Exile followed, and later, a life that ended far from Algeria. Yet his reputation outlived the conflict. Even adversaries recognized him as a founder figure in Algeria's modern political imagination, the embodiment of national resistance to foreign rule. His defeat did not end conflict. It shifted it. French forces continued operations against oases and mountain regions. Some areas were subdued only after prolonged campaigns. Major uprisings flared decades later, demonstrating that conquest on paper did not equal control in reality. Even in the early 20th century, desert zones and borderlands were still being absorbed into the colonial map. Sometimes by force, sometimes by administrative decision, and sometimes by redefining older regional affiliations. French rule in Algeria did not simply begin in 1830 and settle into a stable routine. The way power was imposed between the invasion and the mid-19th century created habits that lasted to the end of colonial rule. Violence became normal. Distrust hardened on both sides, and the two societies that came to live on the same land rarely developed a shared political language. A leading French thinker later claimed that the process of conquest had brutalized the local Muslim society rather than civilizing it, a judgment that reflected how deeply the occupation had reshaped daily life. One of the defining features of the new system was the lack of strong, widely respected intermediaries between the colonial administration and the mass of the population. Traditional authorities were weakened, new ones were often created from above, and the colonial state preferred direct control. At the same time, a growing European settler community increasingly demanded the privileges of a ruling minority, arguing that their interests represented modern politics and republican values. When Algeria was eventually treated in law as part of France, the settlers gained even more leverage because they could send representatives into French political institutions. Over time, they formed roughly a tenth of the population and acted like a permanent pressure group, shaping policy in ways that often deepened inequality. Yet settler domination was not fully secure from the beginning. In the early decades, Algeria remained largely under military administration. The highest authority was usually a soldier, and the structure of rule reflected the logic of occupation rather than civilian government. Much of the countryside was governed through a network of military officers assigned to handle local affairs. These officers often understood local languages and customs and did not always share the settlers' hunger for land and political control. Some even felt closer to the people they administered than to the European lobby in the cities. This produced a central paradox. The period of firm military control, harsh as it was, sometimes restrained settler appetites, while later civilian rule, which spoke the language of democracy, often proved more damaging for the native population because it empowered the settler minority. Colonization advanced through land. After large-scale resistance was broken, a systematic process of confiscation created space for European farms, towns, and private estates. Settlement was not drawn from a single European origin. Different regions attracted different groups, with many Spanish settlers in the west and other European communities concentrated farther east. Officially, the presence of non-French settlers caused anxiety at first, but over time, local schools, climate, and the social environment produced a distinct settler identity, tied to Algeria itself. It was not simply French, yet it was not indigenous either. In another geographic setting, such a community might have moved toward a separate national project. Algeria's closeness to France and the settlers' fear of the Muslim majority pushed in the opposite direction. Tighter attachment to Paris and stronger demands for political guarantees. In 1848, after a political upheaval in France, settlers pushed successfully to have Algeria declared informally French territory. Administration was remodeled along French lines, and colonization accelerated with renewed confidence. A few years later, under a new imperial regime in France, authority briefly shifted toward ministries in Paris. But policy soon became personal and contradictory. The emperor spoke openly about the need for settlers to keep Algeria permanently tied to France. Yet he also framed the colony as a land where France had obligations to the Muslim majority. He described Algeria in blunt terms as an Arab country, a European colony, and a French military camp all at once. For some Algerians, this sounded like the possibility of protection or fairness. Those expectations did not survive the emperor's fall. The collapse of imperial rule in France in 1870 and the rise of a new republican order transformed the balance again. The settler communities saw a chance to expand. At the same time, drought, famine, and social stress sharpened resentment across rural regions. The result was a final major uprising in Kabylia in 1871, a broad mobilization that drew in many communities and challenged the colonial order on a scale not seen since the earlier resistance movements. The suppression was brutal, and its aftermath reshaped the map. More land was taken and new settlement followed, including European refugees from regions of Europe transformed by war. Legal change became another engine of dispossession. Policies that claimed to modernize property ownership often weakened communal or tribal landholding structures and made land easier to purchase, seize, or reclassify. Even when laws were presented as protections, loopholes and administrative maneuvering frequently worked in the opposite direction, fragmenting older rights and exposing communities to loss. As peasants were pushed away from fertile areas, many ended up on marginal lands, near forests or in zones that could not sustain large populations. This displacement did not only impoverish communities, it also contributed to long-term environmental damage as pressure on fragile landscapes increased. The human cost of conquest and early colonization is hard to count precisely, but the scale of suffering is clear. Warfare, famine, and disease struck in repeated waves. Many estimates differ, yet the most credible assessments suggest an enormous demographic shock, with the indigenous population falling dramatically over the decades following invasion and continuing conflict into the 1870s. This loss shaped the countryside, labour patterns, and family structures, and it reinforced a sense that colonial rule was not merely foreign administration, but an existential threat. As the colonial order matured, European settlers gained sweeping dominance in politics, the economy, and public life. Infrastructure expanded, including roads, hospitals, and services, but the distribution was uneven. European communities received the most consistent benefits. Education for Algerians was limited, especially beyond basic schooling, and it was usually offered in French and mainly in towns. Higher education remained out of reach for most. Because modern employment was concentrated in urban centres, where Europeans were strongest, unemployment and underemployment hit Muslim communities hardest, particularly those still rooted in rural and semi-rural life. The colony became a place where two populations lived, under one administration, but in unequal worlds. The First World War altered the picture in unexpected ways. Service in the French army and work in French factories exposed many Algerians to new ideas, new social relations, and new political expectations. Hundreds of thousands were drawn into the war effort. Large numbers of young Algerian men spent years in France, and many remained there afterward, sending money home and supporting families across the Mediterranean. This movement created new networks, new experiences, and a growing awareness that colonial promises rarely matched colonial realities. From these conditions, Algerian nationalism took several forms. One current grew among educated Algerians who worked in French institutions and believed change might come through gradual reform. They sought rights, representation, and legal equality, and some were willing to accept continued union with France if full citizenship and political dignity were genuinely extended. Another current was rooted in religious reform. It emphasized moral renewal, education, and a stronger sense of Muslim Algerian identity. It did not begin as a party machine, yet it powerfully shaped public consciousness. A third current emerged among workers and activists in France and later spread widely inside Algeria. It was more radical and impatient, speaking the language of full national liberation. It gained strength because deprivation was visible, and because repeated attempts at reform were blocked. From time to time, proposals appeared that might have opened a gradual path toward political inclusion. Some plans aimed to grant full citizenship to limited categories of Algerians, without forcing them to abandon personal status rules, rooted in Islamic tradition. Such measures mattered because many Algerians viewed legal status in family matters as a core identity issue, and settlers understood that this could be used to stall reforms indefinitely. When settler opposition crushed these projects before they could be enacted, the message many Algerians heard was blunt. Peaceful reform would be permitted only when it changed nothing. The argument for organised violence, once marginal, began to seem plausible to growing numbers. The Second World War brought another jolt. France's collapse and the Allied landings in North Africa intensified political debate and expectation. Radio propaganda from competing powers promised liberation and a new order. Across the region, colonial subjects heard constant talk about freedom while living under systems that denied it. Algerian leaders attempted again to claim a political future through petitions and manifestos, calling for autonomy and recognition. French authorities offered limited concessions and spoke of obligations owed to Muslims for wartime loyalty. But these steps fell short of the demands spreading through the population. In May 1945, demonstrations that included nationalist symbols set off a chain reaction. Violence erupted, Europeans were killed, and repression followed on a massive scale. Estimates of Muslim deaths vary widely, but the psychological effect is not disputed. The episode destroyed confidence in the possibility of a peaceful settlement. For many, it became a foundational memory, proof that the colonial state would respond to political claims with overwhelming force. The following years saw reforms announced on paper, including promises about citizenship rights, representation, and the role of Arabic in education. Implementation, however, remained weak, selective, or manipulated. Elections were widely viewed as engineered to protect French interests. A political calm existed on the surface, but beneath it, a larger labour migration to France and the growth of political organisations created the conditions for a future rupture. By the early 1950s, legal parties and reform groups had fragmented. A clandestine paramilitary wing, formed, was discovered, and its leaders were arrested. Out of these failures, a new revolutionary network emerged, built by men convinced that only armed action could break the colonial system. The war began at the end of October 1954 with coordinated attacks and a public declaration of aims. An independent Algerian state, a claim to political equality for residents, and a program that combined armed struggle inside Algeria with international diplomacy. The early attacks were not decisive militarily, but the response escalated rapidly. Emergency rule expanded. Troop numbers rose dramatically. As fighting spread, some regions became guerrilla strongholds that the French struggled to control. A major turning point came in 1955 with coordinated violence in the northeast, including the killing of Europeans and Muslim officials seen as collaborators. The retaliation that followed produced heavy Algerian casualties, again with sharply disputed numbers. Either way, the spiral of violence tightened, and the war entered a new phase. French politics fed the conflict. Settler opinion in Algeria could disrupt policy in Paris, and Paris could destabilize Algeria with sudden shifts in leadership and strategy. In 1956, as France granted independence to Morocco and Tunisia, it resolved to hold Algeria at any cost. At the same time, the Algerian movement organized itself more systematically. A major meeting later that year structured the rebellion into regions, clarified political goals, and created governing bodies for the revolution. International diplomacy also intensified, with support networks forming abroad and recognition growing in parts of the world. Urban conflict reached its most notorious form in Algiers, where bombings and assassinations were met with sweeping security operations. The French military dismantled much of the underground network through arrests, torture, and summary killings. Even when insurgent leadership was disrupted, the war did not end. Fortified barriers were built along borders to cut supply lines from Tunisia and Morocco, while units stationed near the frontiers continued to harass the French defensive system. Cross-border incidents increased tensions, including a deadly air attack on a border village that drew international outrage and forced diplomatic mediation. By 1958, the conflict was entangled with a political crisis inside France. Settlers and sympathetic officers in Algeria rose up, demanding tighter integration with France and calling for the return of a strong national leader. The crisis succeeded in reshaping French politics. The new leadership promised reforms, expanded formal citizenship rights, and announced ambitious development plans. Soon afterward, however, a decisive statement recognized that Algerians had the right to choose their future. This triggered settler revolts, including an attempted coup by senior officers. Both collapsed without broad military backing, but they revealed that France was now divided against itself over Algeria. Negotiations eventually began with representatives of the Algerian revolutionary leadership. They stalled, resumed, and proceeded amid violence, including a campaign of terror by extremist settler groups determined to sabotage compromise. In the end, the shape of the settlement became clear. Independence would be decided by referendum. French aid could continue and Europeans would be allowed to leave, remain as foreigners, or take Algerian citizenship. Terror spiked again as the outcome approached, then gradually subsided when it became obvious that violence could no longer reverse the direction of events. In the summer of 1962, Algeria reached the moment that years of war had been moving toward. A nationwide referendum delivered an overwhelming verdict for independence, and the result triggered days of celebration across the country. As crowds filled streets and public squares, the leadership that had represented the struggle moved into the capital in a wave of triumph. At the same time, many Europeans packed what they could carry, arranged transport, and prepared to leave, sensing that the world they had known was ending. No final tally has ever fully settled the human cost of the conflict. French losses are often counted in the tens of thousands for soldiers and several thousand for civilians, while Algerian losses remain far more disputed, ranging from several 100,000 to numbers claimed far higher. Beyond deaths and injuries, the war reshaped the landscape and the population itself. Villages were ruined, forests were damaged over wide areas, and millions of people were displaced into new settlements. The end of violence did not bring immediate stability. Independence arrived alongside the practical shock of rebuilding a state, while the country was still carrying the scars of war. The departure of Europeans created a sudden vacuum in the upper levels of administration and technical expertise. Many of the people who managed public services, large farms, factories, and key offices were gone within a short time. Some sectors continued to function because routine systems and local workers kept them alive, yet the strain was obvious. Schools, for example, faced severe shortages of staff. Production also fell sharply in agriculture, an industry where management and specialized skills had been concentrated. Unemployment and underemployment rose to levels that felt overwhelming for a society already exhausted by years of upheaval. The new state inherited a complicated legacy of land ownership. Abandoned property and estates left behind by departing Europeans were taken under state control. Within a year, land that remained in French hands was also brought under national ownership. In the countryside, the government attempted to keep export agriculture alive, not least because foreign earnings were essential, and some state-run farms focused on crops that could still be sold abroad. Worker committees were often tasked with running these enterprises, an approach shaped by the revolutionary mood of the time and by the sheer necessity of keeping production going with the personnel available. Independence did not produce unity at the top. The struggle for power inside the revolutionary camp surfaced quickly, and it did so in a country full of weapons, competing command structures, and leaders who had earned loyalty in different arenas. Rivalries opened between political figures associated with the provisional authorities and commanders who controlled armed forces on the borders. Former leaders returned from detention and entered a tense political landscape, bringing new alliances and new ambitions. One faction formed a political centre of gravity intended to challenge the old provisional leadership, while other figures rallied to defend the existing order. At the same time, commanders who had fought inside the country often rejected both camps, resenting the influence of external forces and insisting that those who carried the war at home should not be sidelined in the peace. The atmosphere deteriorated enough that open fighting began to appear in scattered clashes. The risk of a civil war was real, yet the general population, battered by nearly 8 years of war, pushed back against the idea of more bloodshed. Demonstrations and public pressure helped force a political outcome before the crisis became unstoppable. Through negotiation and tactical manoeuvring, a list of candidates for a new National Assembly was assembled, and then approved by a large majority. The Assembly, once formed, asked one leader to build the first government of independent Algeria, and that decision became the hinge on which the early state turned. With the backing of powerful military figures, the new head of government consolidated authority. Armed resistance did not disappear, and localized rebellion erupted in Kabylia, led by well-known figures from the independent struggle itself. The new state answered with force, framing the revolt as a threat to unity. Inside the ruling circle, tensions continued. Governing style mattered as much as ideology. Bold promises, personal rule, and international posturing created friction in an administration that needed discipline, stable budgeting, and coherent institutions. Infighting intensified, opponents were pushed out, and some left the country under dramatic circumstances. Assassinations and purges created an atmosphere where political survival depended on loyalty, not debate. By the mid-1960s, the most decisive contest was settled not in Parliament, but inside the relationship between political leadership and the army. When an attempt appeared to be forming to remove the top military commander and weaken his network, the army moved first. A coup removed the head of government. Many Algerians accepted the change because they were frustrated by disorder and had little patience for leadership that seemed erratic. Even so, the new regime began without deep popular enthusiasm. It relied, above all, on military cohesion. Over the following years, the new ruler did not govern with theatrical gestures. Power was tightened steadily and methodically. The dominant party was reorganized to fit the new reality, and institutions were built slowly, sometimes more to manage society than to represent it. Elections were held at the local and provincial level before national legislative elections returned much later. The political system increasingly resembled a centralized state where participation existed, but dissent had narrow limits. economic policy took a strongly state-directed path. Agrarian reform aimed to weaken large, private holdings and redistribute land through cooperative structures. Plans were also promoted to reorganize rural life into new settlements that could be supplied with modern amenities, education, and services. The state expanded its hold over major industries and natural resources. A decisive moment came when foreign interests in oil and gas were taken under national control. Rising global oil prices in the 1970s dramatically increased revenue and gave the government the confidence to pursue a sweeping industrialization drive. State corporations were created to manage each sector, and the National Energy Company emerged as a pillar of the entire system. Factories, transport networks, and heavy industry were presented as the foundations of a modern Algeria, funded by petroleum earnings and directed by a centralized bureaucracy. That model, however, carried vulnerabilities. Political life was dominated by a single party, and the state tolerated little organized opposition. Policy could move quickly when money was abundant, but public accountability remained weak. When the long-serving leader died at the end of the 1970s, there was uncertainty about succession, and the choice of the next president reflected a compromise between the party and the army. The new era began with promises of reform and a different tone, but the underlying problem remained. The system depended heavily on energy income and on a political structure that could suppress conflict rather than resolve it. During the 1980s, the state began loosening control. Large state corporations were broken into smaller units, private enterprise gained limited encouragement, and authority was gradually shifted toward elected local bodies. Media restrictions eased somewhat, travel became less controlled, and official ideology lost its earlier certainty. Over time, even state outlets criticized the old socialist language. Yet liberalization unfolded alongside deep shocks that the government struggled to manage. Religious militancy rose across the wider region after major events in the Muslim world, and Algeria felt the impact. Domestic problems added fuel. When oil prices fell sharply in the middle of the decade, the country's finances tightened. The state could no longer sustain the employment and welfare expectations that had been built during years of high revenue. Shortages spread, housing became a crisis, and public frustration intensified. Foreign debt rose, and unemployment climbed to levels that transformed daily life for a large portion of the population. Agriculture, already weakened by bureaucracy and poor incentives, suffered under harsh drought. Water shortages became frequent, disrupting cities and industry. Rapid population growth increased demand for jobs and services faster than the state could supply them. Corruption became a common accusation, not a whispered rumor. The pressure exploded in mass riots, including in major cities. Confronted with anger and a legitimacy crisis, the leadership chose political opening as a survival strategy. A new constitution removed the language of socialism, ended the one-party monopoly, and allowed multi-party politics. That shift released political energy that had been bottled up for decades. Many parties appeared, but the greatest beneficiary was an Islamist movement that drew support from popular resentment, religious networks, and anger at incompetence and corruption. It captured strong results in local elections and appeared poised to become the dominant force nationally. This set the stage for a confrontation between electoral politics and the military establishment. When parliamentary voting produced a major Islamist victory in the first round and pointed toward an even larger win in the second, the army intervened. The president resigned, elections were cancelled, and a new ruling structure was imposed. A respected veteran of the revolutionary era was brought in as head of state. but he was assassinated within months. Algeria slid into a period of violence that hardened into civil war. The war that followed was marked by fear, fractured authority, and terrible uncertainty about responsibility. Islamist armed groups carried out attacks and massacres. State forces, militias, and shadowy elements inside the security apparatus were also accused of violence, and later, evidence and testimony fueled enduring debate about how much of the bloodshed was controlled, infiltrated, or exploited by competing forces. Civilians were caught between threats, collective punishment, and terror. Journalists, intellectuals, and public officials were targeted. The death toll rose into the tens of thousands and then higher, and whole communities lived under the logic of survival rather than politics. Attempts to restore legitimacy came through elections and constitutional change, but these processes were contested. A president elected in the mid-1990s faced skepticism and continued violence. A referendum amended the constitution, yet opposition parties raised allegations of manipulation. A new pro-government party was created and quickly gained dominance, helped by the machinery of the state. Parliamentary and local elections reinforced that new balance. By the end of the decade, a figure associated with the earlier revolutionary state returned to the presidency under the shadow of boycotted elections, and the government pursued a policy of national reconciliation. Peace initiatives offered amnesty and reintegration for fighters who surrendered, while granting protections and legal cover for security forces and allied militias. Families of the disappeared were offered compensation, but critics argued that the measures limited truth and blocked accountability. Some militants laid down arms, and overall violence declined, yet armed remnants remained active. Algeria entered the new century with a reduced level of conflict, but with wounds that had not healed, and with political arrangements designed to secure stability, even if that meant limiting open debate. Meanwhile, constitutional changes extended presidential power. Term limits were removed, enabling long tenure. Elections continued, and some were judged more credible than earlier contests. But political space remained tightly managed. The state presented itself as pragmatic. Revolutionary rhetoric survived in speeches and symbols, yet decisions often aimed at balancing alliances, keeping markets stable, and protecting national sovereignty in a volatile region. Foreign policy after independence mixed idealism with calculation. Algeria offered support to anti-colonial and liberation movements and positioned itself as a voice for non-alignment during the Cold War. It supported causes in Asia and Africa, and it gave consistent attention to Palestine. Yet it also played mediator when circumstances demanded, including in high-stakes international crises. In energy diplomacy, Algeria tried to defend higher oil prices within the producer bloc, but often found itself negotiating among competing interests. Relations with Morocco remained among the most sensitive regional issues. A brief border war soon after independence left a residue of mistrust. Later, the conflict over Western Sahara sharpened tensions, with Algeria backing a Sahrawi independence movement, while Morocco sought to incorporate the territory. Periods of thaw did occur, including high-level meetings and restored diplomatic ties, but disputes repeatedly returned, and the question remained a lasting fault line in Maghrebi politics. Efforts to build regional unity produced new organizations and ambitious plans for cooperation. Early enthusiasm promised shared infrastructure such as roads and railways. Over time, rivalries and unresolved disputes weakened momentum, and joint projects stalled. The region's political geography proved harder to unify than its shared history and cultural ties suggested. Relations with France carried their own weight. Early disputes centered on abandoned property and the nationalization of energy assets. Economic tensions also shaped policy, including conflicts over exports that had once depended on French markets. Algerian migrants in France faced discrimination and precarious lives, and their situation became part of a larger, often painful, post-colonial relationship. In the 1990s, Algerian violence crossed borders, with attacks in France intensifying fears and hardening attitudes. Still, economic ties remained, even as Algeria diversified trade and reduced France's dominance by building links with a wider range of partners. As Europe's institutions expanded their influence in the Mediterranean, Algeria's relationship with the broader European bloc became more important. Partnerships were created to encourage stability and economic cooperation across the region. European funding supported restructuring and privatization in parts of the Algerian economy, though results were mixed and often controversial. Algeria was initially wary of outside scrutiny during the worst years of internal violence. But international delegations eventually visited, seeking to understand the crisis and encourage an end to the bloodshed. By the time violence declined, the country had travelled a long road from the euphoria of 1962. Independence brought sovereignty, but also bitter power struggles, economic experiments tied to oil, and a traumatic civil conflict that reshaped society. The state that emerged placed stability at the centre of its identity, even when that stability carried heavy costs in political openness. The deeper story, stretching across decades, was not only about governments and constitutions, but about how a society tried to rebuild itself after war, manage rapid change, and survive repeated shocks without losing its sense of nationhood.